In a world now saturated with adult animation, there are only a handful of series that have garnered the iconic status to end up on the medium's Mount Rushmore, if you will. The 80s had The Simpsons, the 90s had South Park, the 2000s had Family Guy, and you would be hard-pressed to hand the 2010s to any series other than Rick and Morty. There was a time, as a lot of you can surely recall, when Rick and Morty ruled the world. Everywhere you looked, the mania was inescapable. But now, only a few short years after its peak, the show has become just another adult animated series that doesn't have anywhere near the same recognition as it once did. In a way, this is the expected arc for every new shiny thing. But the speed at which Rick and Morty catapulted to ruling the zeitgeist and then lost it is fairly unique. The fall of this show's quality has been discussed ad nauseum on the internet.
I came into every episode with optimism, and week after week, I was disappointed.
For me, Season 4 is starting to feel like the beginning of the end.
I'm struggling to find a cohesive way of phrasing this, so I'll just outright say it. Rick and Morty fell off.
But what if we went beyond the surface-level critiques and truly delved into the factors that shaped the cartoon's rise and fall? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers and examine the real-world context that influenced the show's trajectory. We'll dive deep into the minds of the troubled geniuses who crafted and then squandered the most beloved series of our generation. We'll take a look at the missteps that led to the show's downfall, as well as the external forces that were beyond anyone's control, all while following the timeline that charts this long story journey. Because the truth is, Rick and Morty is a miracle in the world of television, but it's also a tragedy. It's a show where the very forces that fueled its brilliance ultimately led to its unraveling. And it all began with one man named Dan Harmon.
He's a little narcissistic. He's got a bit of an ego.
A troublemaker.
A podcaster.
An alcoholic.
He's probably the first person to say he's self-destructive.
I think Dan would describe himself as a human hand grenade who has a predilection for pulling his own pin out.
Long before Dan became known as the genius, narcissistic, neurotic, arrogant, and self-sabotaging mastermind of television he's known as today, he was just a kid in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with an early and intense obsession with storytelling. He briefly attended 2 separate Midwestern art colleges, but ended up dropping out before completing a degree at either school. Harmon began his career in comedy in the 1990s, performing stand-up and participating in improv where he honed his skills. In the latter part of that decade, Harmon moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career in television writing. There he met Rob Schraub, a fellow Milwaukee native with whom he formed what would become a lasting creative partnership. In 2003, out of frustration with the systematic changes of breaking into the industry, Harmon and Schraub founded Channel 101. A monthly short film festival in LA, which became a breeding ground for innovative and offbeat comedy, with the two men at the forefront.
We spent, a good 5 or 6 years really doing nothing of any merit, of any net worth.
Waiting, like a lot of people, like actors and writers and directors who are waiting for their big break, and we said, let's make our own luck.
The platform allowed Dan to experiment with storytelling techniques, and it became a launching pad for many of his future collaborators. It was during this period when Harmon began to formalize his theories on narrative structure. He developed the influential Story Circle, an adaptation of writer Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, which he used as a guide for crafting plots. The Story Circle became a hallmark of Harmon's writing process, providing a framework for creating compelling and emotionally resonant stories. Harmon's first significant break came when he was hired as a writer for the Sarah Silverman program on Comedy Central, which aired from 2007 to 2010. His work on the show, and known for its edgy and surreal humor, earned him recognition in the television industry. That being said, it was in this environment that his signature obstinacy would flare up and cause him to be fired only a few episodes in the first season's run for being too controlling over the writing process and stepping on Sarah's toes. As he himself elaborated in an interview, "A couple episodes into the writing process, I started lipping off to Sarah too much. I get obsessive. I want to make everything perfect, and I have a delusion that I'm the one who has to make that happen. I really should have been thinking, I'm a guy that Sarah Silverman gave a great opportunity to work on this thing."
Yeah, we both had visions for the show. I mean, the truth is, every single thing he wrote was amazing. And that's how bad it had to be that I was willing to give that up. I'm his biggest fan, and I fired him.
In 2009, Harmon got his first real opportunity to sit in the captain's chair when he created Community, a sitcom that aired on NBC. The show, inspired by Harmon's own experiences at community college, followed a diverse study group of students who formed an unlikely family. Community was noted for its meta-humor, pop culture references, and willingness to experiment with various genres and narrative structures. Harmon's story circle was a key tool in crafting the episodes, which often subverted traditional sitcom tropes. Community garnered a passionate fan base and critical acclaim, though it struggled with ratings throughout its run. Despite its challenges, the show solidified Harmon's reputation as a unique and innovative voice in producing brilliant TV comedy. It also solidified his reputation as an utterly egotistical and manic black hole that was a pain to work with.
But Dan, I work for this company and it has a brand and the guy that owns it has these sensibilities and they're not my sensibilities. I'm on the side of the creative and I consider it my job to protect the creative's vision and the harsh realities of the market. You know what? You.
Unfortunately for everyone else who worked on Community, he was not the only contributor to the show that embodied the role of pompous egomaniac. As veteran comic actor Chevy Chase constantly butted heads with him during production of the episodes. The tension between the two came to a head when, on his podcast Harmontown, Dan played a voicemail from Chevy that garnered a lot of toxic publicity for the show.
And your writing is getting worse and worse, so suck my I don't get talked to like that by anybody, certainly not in front of my wife and daughter.
In May of 2012, creative differences with NBC led to Harmon being fired from Community after its third season. The show's senior year, made without him, aired to terrible reviews by fans and critics alike. Harmon would later describe watching the season as,
"Not f***ing cool, man. It was like, just flipping through Instagram, just watching your girlfriend just million."
Fortunately for Harmon, greater opportunities awaited him on the horizon. After getting booted from Community, he was soon approached by Adult Swim. While they had numerous cult classics under their belt since their launch in 2001, the network had long dreamed of having their own primetime hit show. Mike Lazo, founder and head of the niche channel, felt that Dan Harmon was the perfect creative mastermind to pilot such a vehicle. Harmon was initially hesitant, viewing Adult Swim as the wrong fit for his writing style given his complete unfamiliarity with animation. So he turned to a longtime friend who he had met back in the early days of running Channel 101. That friend, of course, was none other than Justin Roiland. Justin Roiland was born on February 21st, 1980 in Stockton, California. Unlike Harmon, he grew up in a creative environment, encouraged by his family to explore his artistic and comedic talents. After high school, Justin pursued his passion for art and film at Modesto Junior College, where he studied for a couple of years before moving to Los Angeles to immerse himself in the entertainment industry. He began working in reality television in the early 2000s after his friend offered him a PA job. Using that one gig as a jumping-off point, Roiland did production work in that sector of the industry for a short while. He met Harmon in 2003 and immediately found a home. The concept behind Harmon's Channel 101 festival was simple yet revolutionary. Filmmakers would create 5-minute pilots for potential web series which would be screened before a live audience. The viewers in turn would vote on their favorites, and the top 5 shows would be renewed for another episode the following month. Harmon's vision for Channel 101 was to create a platform that democratized the television pilot process, allowing anyone with a camera and a good idea to participate. The festival allowed creators to experiment with new ideas, push boundaries, and receive immediate feedback from an engaged audience. Justin Roiland submitted many films to this festival, often appalling audiences with his dark sense of humor. One of his entries was particularly grotesque, featuring the brutal murder of children. Even if his submissions were not always warmly received by the voters, Dan Harmon started to take a liking to Roiland's brand of off-putting zaniness, and encouraged him to continue. In Justin's own words from a 2014 interview, "The first thing we made, I think Dan hated it, and then he watched me grow as a writer and sort of became a fan of the stuff I was doing. I remember Dan being very intimidating at first. Everyone feels like Dan hates them when they first meet Dan Harmon. It's funny now because we've been friends for 10 years, and I told him that years ago and he thought it was hilarious. One of Roiland's projects that emerged from Channel 101 was a pilot called House of Cosbys, which premiered on January 30th, 2005, and became a surprise hit online.
He was a Cosby fan at heart, it's clear. He searched and found a Cosby hair. He spent 10 long years and built a cloning machine, and now he's accomplished his wonderful dream to make a House of Cosbys. It's a House of Cosbys.
Notice the lightning on the title text accompanied by zapping sound effects. Maybe you've seen something like that before. The pilot quickly went viral, sparking widespread buzz from the young animator. The series was even on the verge of being picked up by MTV, which would have been a dream come true for Roiland. But all this came to a screeching halt when Cosby's estate issued a cease and desist. Roiland was furious. This anger would ignite the fire in his belly, which led him to create his magnum opus, The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, a short which features crudely drawn parody versions of Doc Brown and Marty McFly from Back to the Future. It starts with Marty complaining about his kite being in a tree, to which Doc proposes a solution. If you've seen the short, you know what the solution is.
It's the only way to fix our time travel car. You have to lick my Marty.
Roiland made the pilot, which was essentially an enormous troll as a form of therapy to help cope with how his ticket to mainstream success went up in flames. I was just blowing off steam. Initially, the concept was, I'm going to make something and try to get another cease and desist letter, just to see if I could. As you can see, though it's far from what the show would eventually become, this short is unmistakably Rick and Morty. The banter between the two, the nonsensical stammering, the drooling, their hair, that weird mouth expression, all the elements that would later become iconic. Justin would later say, during the middle of the line, a burp came out naturally. It was just so funny and gross. I was like, well, let's see if I can do that again for a couple more lines. When the short premiered at Channel 101, it elicited groans, accrued a small measure of notoriety online, and then life moved on for the disgruntled animator. But Roiland discovered that he loved the voices he used for the sketch, and continued to fit them into his work for years.
Larry, Barry, and Gary. You go first.
Okay, here we go. Mitchell, we want you to quit your job for the following reasons.
You know what she said to me?
Oh, Reggie, what'd she say, man?
Tell her what she said. I'll tell you what she said.
In the meantime, Roiland and Harmon began collaborating on more and more projects, like the viral internet sketch Googas in 2009.
What the hell are these crazy Googas? Right? That's what we're gonna call them?
In 2010, Roiland began the Grandma's Virginity podcast with two of his longtime friends. The same year he started this show, 2 new animated series came out in which he voiced characters, Fishhooks on Disney Channel and Adventure Time on Cartoon Network, contributing to his growing reputation as a voice actor. One day in 2012, Justin received a call from Dan Harmon, who told him that he had been approved by Adult Swim for a development deal. Harmon asked Roiland if he had any ideas, and in his own words, Justin's mind immediately went to the 2 voices he had fallen in love with doing. Harmon and Justin broke it down in an interview with the LA Times in 2014. I knew I wanted to work with Justin if I was going to work at Adult Swim because, the truth is, my sensibilities left to their own devices are pretty bad. I'm not a huge animation guy by nature, and so I thought about Justin because he is the Adult Swim brand. What excited me about it was Justin was always laughing and having a great time with these characters. I think we wrote the pilot script in 6 or 8 hours. Yeah, we broke the story the same day that we pitched it to the network and then went and drafted it up right after that. It's not always that fast. It was kind of lightning in a bottle. The script for the pilot may have been completed in record time, but there were still obstacles that needed to be cleared before Rick and Morty could make it to air. At first, Adult Swim was resistant to the idea of Roiland doing the voices of both titular characters, arguing that having 2 separate voice actors play off each other would lead to a better dynamic. In order to quell their fears on Justin's ability to carry the show, the writers wrote and drew an animatic for the cold open in which Morty accidentally creates a dinosaur.
Oh, Morty, that's a bad idea.
You don't want to move that box too close to the other thing.
Okay, Rick. I'll just move the other thing then.
No, Morty, don't!
What?
Now you made a dinosaur, Morty. I told you not to touch that thing, and then you went ahead and you made a dinosaur.
What?
The network wasn't entirely in love with this preview, evidenced by the fact that the actual cold open for the show's pilot turned out to be entirely different. But they still relented and allowed Roiland to perform the role of both characters, and with that, production continued on.
Here's how I know Rick and Morty gets made. I wake up in the morning, at 10, get here at 11. We f*** around, talk about TV until noon. Hopefully Justin comes in and goes like, I'm Mr. Jiggle Nuts.
Morty, can you hear me? Yeah, Rick, I can hear you. All right, I'm putting you into his neck right now.
Oh, shit, Rick, this is crazy.
The writer's room for Rick and Morty consisted of 7 self-described man-children. Harmon, Roiland, Tom Kaufman, Ryan Ridley, Wade Randolph, Eric Acosta, and Mike McMahon, making it a fairly small one, and yet often hours would fly by without any meaningful work getting done. There was an unapologetic, boyish, and immature energy in the room, which undoubtedly contributed to the irreverent style the show would go on to take.
In the writer's room, I had some binoculars, and I was using them to look at people as they walked around down below.
I don't know if it's illegal what he's doing, but it's definitely disturbing.
After deciding on a story, a writer was assigned to create an outline. Roiland and Harmon would usually do a pass on this early framework before sending it back to the writers to go through several more drafts, before finally receiving their approval. Ridley, a longtime collaborator of both of the show's creators, was one of the biggest creative influences on the team, as evidenced by all of his Comic-Con appearances for the program. Justin, like Dan, was incredibly neurotic. Harmon and Roiland's dynamic as co-steerers of the show very quickly devolved into a tug-of-war between story and nonsense. Roiland was an agent of chaos, always wanting to go off on some insane detour, whereas Dan's role was reining in the zaniness to keep things in the parameter of a satisfying story with emotional beats and rewarding payoffs. This would be a long-running internal battle in Rick and Morty, and I would argue is why the show was so good.
No wonder you're constantly fighting with each other and behind schedule.
What?
Nothing.
It seems like half the time, it's important that half the time we all remember that Justin's right when he says that. Why can't he just come in and say, I'm Mr. Flippadappadoo, do-da-gappadoo? And half the time we do actually need to say, okay, calm down, boss.
One way Harmon was able to keep the train on the rails was by employing his story circle as a rigid guideline for the show, ensuring both the A and B plots of every episode hit all 8 steps of his device. 1. The character is in a zone of comfort. 2. The character needs something. 3. The character enters an unfamiliar situation. 4. The character adapts to it. 5. The character gets what they wanted. 6. The character pays a heavy price. 7. The character returns to their familiar situation. 8. Having changed. While Harmon primarily holed himself up in the writer's room, Roiland was charged with much more responsibility, overseeing the entire production of the show, including the animation side of things. Ryan Elder, a longtime collaborator, was brought on board as Rick and Morty's composer. Interestingly, the show's theme song was originally created by Elder for Justin's earlier unsuccessful pilot, Dog World. Somewhere along the way, it was decided that Roiland would begin writing the descriptions for the episodes that would be shown on TV listings and streaming services, which is why they often careen off into nonsense that provides little insight into the episode. I.e., episode 10's, Rick has a run-in with some old associates, resulting in a fallout with Morty. You got any chips, bruh? As the release date drew closer, the marketing campaign was in full swing. Trailers for the show began airing on television that many fans would later criticize for getting Morty's age wrong.
Morty just wants to be an ordinary 12-year-old.
I need your help, Morty.
But with a grandpa like Rick,
Parker, right here, Morty, right here.
easier said than done.
In July and October of 2013, Harmon and Roiland hit the convention circuit with the cast in order to drum up excitement for the show they had worked on for the past few months.
At its core, I mean, we've created, we're hoping for this to be like The Simpsons of Adult Swim.
Cartoons?
Yeah, The Simpsons of... Wait, is that that's right?
Simpsons of cartoons, yeah.
Thanks a lot, pal.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
After these press junkets were said and done, all that was left was for the season to air.
Look at all the crazy crap surrounding us. I mean, look at that thing right there. What the hell is that thing?
Just a note before we go any further, for the sake of brevity, we'll only be covering the significant episodes in Rick and Morty's journey as a series. Of course, in Season 1, the first major example of this is the pilot. The first episode of the official television program begins with an intoxicated Rick bursting into Morty's room in the middle of the night and declaring he has a surprise to show him. After he takes Morty out in his newly furnished flying car, Rick reveals the surprise is that he's going to drop a bomb he built and destroy the world. The terrified Morty fights Rick to take control of the ship. Rick eventually relents to Morty's insistence and parks the craft on the ground, where he passes out on a pile of beer cans. The bomb then announces that it's armed, and as the clock ticks down, the opening theme starts. This cold open, which was recorded in Justin Roiland's garage, establishes a lot of important things right off the bat. 1. Morty is not just a hopeless whipping boy, but a willing agent able to stand up to his demented grandpa, skating past what could have easily become a tired premise and introducing instead an engaging central dynamic. 2. We learn how irreverent the show is with its own stakes and storytelling, as the plot point with the bomb is never mentioned again or resolved in any meaningful way. And finally, the cold open establishes the show's now iconic opening sequence, which displays several visually striking sci-fi scenes starring our titular characters, even though half of them are never shown in the show proper. The rest of the pilot moves at a breakneck pace and has consistently funny beats, even if many parts are totally unrecognizable when compared to what the show looked like when it hit its stride. Still, the episode sets up many important elements for the show with varying degrees of success. Morty Smith is presented as a dumb, awkward, anxious, yet good-hearted 14-year-old boy. Summer Smith, in this episode, is given no character besides being a cliché older teen sister for Morty. Their mother, Beth, is shown to be a smart and independent horse doctor who is helplessly desperate for her father's love and acknowledgement. Jerry Smith, like Morty, is established as a foil to Rick and a pathetic patriarch to the Smith family. Rick's disposition in the pilot is handedly the roughest in terms of correctly predicting what his character would end up being. While he is an alcoholic mad scientist grandpa who has recently crashed at his daughter's house after being absent during her childhood, he hasn't been fully fleshed out yet. The laughs the show derives from him in this episode are sourced differently than the laughs his more developed incarnation will draw. The art style of this pilot also did well in being instantly distinguishable from its contemporaries, with its Dr. Seuss-inspired environments and distinctive scribbles for pupils. But even more notable than the art style was Justin's comedic voice for the show, which materialized with the titular characters stuttering through the gut-busting dialogue.
It's just Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty and their adventures, Morty.
While the series was not the first to have its voice actors stumbling and improvising through their lines, i.e. home movies, it was the first show to play it up to the extent that it did. This style, contrasted with Harmon's conceptual storytelling and dark wit, made for a promising pilot, even if all the kinks hadn't been ironed out yet. After the pilot, the series showed its first sign of finding itself in its next episode, Lawnmower Dog. In the episode's A-plot, the titular pair intercept the dreams of Morty's math teacher, Mr. Goldenfold, so that he'll give him a better grade. The dreamception quickly spirals out of control, leading them through a series of increasingly bizarre and dangerous dreamscapes. For the B-plot, Jerry asks Rick to increase the mental faculties of the family dog, Snuffles, whose design was based off of Roiland's real-life dog, who soon becomes super intelligent and starts plotting a canine uprising. This structure would become the show's classic episodic framework. An A-plot with Rick and Morty and a B-plot with the rest of the cast. The episode also establishes the show's inclination to parody existing sci-fi properties with their stories, like Inception and Flowers for Algernon in this instance. In comparison to the previous episode, Rick seems a lot more like the version of the character we recognize today. Gone is the wacky Doc Brown parody from the pilot, and in its place is the coherent, laid-back, and sardonic scientist that the show would maintain. Even Justin's voice acting for him sounds a lot more refined between the two episodes. Lawnmower Dog also features the first post-credit scene of the show, which is a staple that they have maintained for every episode after. All in all, this is the first strong installment of the show and a step up from the shaky pilot. One of the first episodes of Rick and Morty to truly catch in the popular zeitgeist was Me Seeks and Destroy. In it, Rick gives a fed-up Morty the opportunity to lead an adventure, resulting in a dangerous quest where they encounter giant beings, medieval fantasy tropes, and a creepy jelly bean. Meanwhile, at home, the Smith family uses a device that summons helpful beings called Meeseeks to solve their problems, and their attempts to help escalate into chaos as they struggle with Jerry's lack of ability to improve his golf game. This is an important episode and a fan favorite for many reasons. For one, Meeseeks became the show's first viral character, sprouting up in countless internet memes after the episode aired. Secondly, this episode was the one to introduce Rick's iconic catchphrase of "Wubba-lubba-dub-dub!", a riff on a corny character catchphrase in sitcoms from years past. Bazinga. Thirdly, it plants the seeds of Rick's affection for Morty when he kills King Jellybean, a character who had sexually assaulted the young man earlier in the story. Previously, it had been unclear if the elderly scientist even cared about his grandson at all, but this was the first sign that there was love in the relationship. The story was almost fully rejected by standards and practices because of the harrowing nature of the assault scene, and it took a lot of arguing from the writers to keep it included. In an interview, Roiland said, "I wanted to make sure that we weren't making light of that kind of thing. I remember the first storyboard I got for it was very cartoony. Mr. Jellybean was climbing up Morty's back, and it was not as weighty and grounded. I was just like, this needs to feel like a scene from a Jodie Foster movie. It can't be jokey. It needs to feel really straight and dramatic and horrifying because it is." The idea for the titular Meeseeks, and thus the entire episode, occurred when Roiland became frustrated trying to think of a decent plot.
Like at some point, I remember Justin just rolling around on the floor, saying literally, "I'm Mr. Meeseeks, look at me."
Well, yeah, we forced it because we were breaking a story that he hated, and then he just snapped, and I was like, why don't we just do these creatures called the Meeseeks? And they go, Mr. Meeseeks!
In perhaps the most important episode of Season 1, Rick Potion number 9 sees Morty ask Rick for a love potion to use on his crush, Jessica, during the school dance. The concoction inadvertently spreads to the entire school due to a flu outbreak, causing everyone to fall madly in love with Morty. Rick attempts to fix the situation, only making things worse, resulting in a global catastrophe where everyone turns into grotesque mutants called Cronenbergs. Realizing the world is beyond saving, Rick and Morty abandon their reality and move to an alternate dimension where their counterparts have just died and take their places. The story concludes with Morty walking around his house with a 1,000-yard stare, shell-shocked by his new permanent status quo. This was a huge installment for the series, being the first to truly cement the show's themes of existentialism. What had been a cleverly written and hilarious sci-fi parody cartoon up until this point had now ascended into an exploration of philosophical themes that truly capture the attention of its rapidly growing audience. The ending implies that unlike the goofy escapades we had witnessed up until this episode, this adventure's impact on Morty will be long-lasting and deeply felt. But more than just affecting Morty, the show's viewers now had to deal with knowing that the family they had followed up until this point was gone, and never coming back, which was a bold and unprecedented choice. Even the creators admitted to being intimidated by the bar they had set for themselves only 6 episodes in. This was followed by a 2-month mid-season break, and they could not have picked a stronger note to pause on. To give you an idea of how well received Rick Potion number 9 was, on the Season 1 Blu-ray, Matt Groening and other Simpsons writers provided a commentary for it. In this commentary, they actually asked Roiland to produce a couch gag for the show in an offer that he would later take up.
All right, Justin, this is the point. We were going to have a special surprise. We'd like to ask you to do a Simpsons couch gag. So when you listen to this commentary in a year and a half, please get back to us.
If ever. If we're still on the air.
I hope we're still on.
The next episode of the show, titled Raising Gazorpazorp, marked the show's return, and has a far less momentous premise than its predecessor. In it, Morty convinces Rick to buy him a realistic sex robot, which unexpectedly produces an alien hybrid baby. Rick and Summer travel to the robot's home planet, Gazorpazorp, to understand more about its origin, discovering a society strictly divided by gender, where hyper-aggressive males are kept separate from advanced, intelligent females. Meanwhile, Morty tries to raise the rapidly maturing alien baby, who exhibits violent tendencies. The story concludes with Rick rethinking his prejudice against female sidekicks and gifting Summer a pink spaceship that never appears in the show again. While this is an episode most people put low in their rankings, it was actually one of Dan Harmon's favorites at the time. Since then, after internalizing the fan response, his opinions on it have diminished greatly. In an interview in 2017, he said, "I was so proud while I was writing it, and then I read people's comments on it, how it felt stale in 80s in its observations about gender, and now I hate it and want it to die by fire. But that's because of people's reactions, or I would love it." This episode is also significant in that it's the first one where Rick and Morty spend the majority of the runtime separated in their respective plots, something that would become far less common in the later seasons of the show. In the 8th episode, titled "60 Minutes," Rick installs interdimensional cable on the family TV, allowing the grandparent and grandchild to watch bizarre shows from infinite alternate realities. Meanwhile, Jerry, Beth, and Summer use a device to view alternate versions of their lives, revealing unfulfilled dreams and alternate choices. This causes tension and introspection within the family, especially for Beth and Jerry, who question their marriage. This is the first anthology episode of the series, and is viewed by many fans as their greatest effort tackling the genre. For one, all the programs and commercials the characters watch are clearly heavily improvised by Roiland, with many of its funniest moments being entirely off script. But despite essentially being a variety show of silly ad-libbing, the episode is one of the earliest significant enforcers of canon in the show, with a touching scene between Morty and Summer that references Rick Potion number 9, ensuring that the consequences would not be ignored going forward. For these reasons, this is a beloved installment, and as such has remained one of the most critically acclaimed of the show's run. It's obvious that the Adult Swim executives were keenly aware that this episode would be a special one, because in the hours leading up to the television airing, the full episode was posted to the Rick and Morty Instagram account in more than 100 15-second clips. The next important part of the season is episode 10, titled "Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind," in which the titular scientist is accused of murdering other versions of himself across different dimensions, and is brought before the Council of Ricks. To prove his innocence, Rick and Morty go on the run, discovering that an evil Rick is the true culprit. In the last few seconds of the story, though, he is revealed to the audience to be controlled by his mysterious eye patch-wearing Morty. This is a monumental episode for the show in terms of setting up canon and lore. The Council of Ricks, a parody of the Council of Reeds from Marvel's Fantastic Four, would become a heavily reoccurring aspect of the series. Even seemingly nonsensical sci-fi words introduced here, like the central finite curve, would later be expanded in the show. Most importantly, this episode proved that Rick and Morty could stick the landing of taking its stories and stakes seriously, while not losing its hilarious and irreverent edge. This is a balance that the show would fail to maintain in subsequent seasons, but we'll get to that later. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind also established the iconic character fans would quickly dub Evil Morty, as a cool and enigmatic antagonist. He generated a lot of buzz and excitement from its fandom, with viewers anxiously awaiting his return as soon as the needle drop hit the end of the episode. All in all, a near-perfect installment of the show that had officially found its groove. In the season finale, titled "Ricksy Business," Jerry and Beth go on a Titanic-themed vacation, leaving Rick to throw a rager at their house despite Morty's objections. The party spirals out of control as interdimensional guests arrive, leading to chaotic and surreal situations. Rick eventually uses his technology to restore the house to its pre-party state just before Jerry and Beth return, narrowly avoiding their wrath. At the time, fans who loved the canon side of the show were disappointed, and thought season 1 ended on a whimper. What these particular audience members, and perhaps even the showrunners themselves, did not realize, though, was that this episode was setting up a bunch of new lore. Characters like Bird Person, Tammy, Squanch, and Gearhead would all make significant appearances later on. You can hear in Roiland's voice a pride at the work that they had achieved up to this point as he reads the final lines, bringing season 1 to a close.
That's season 1, boom! Season 1, I'm getting in your face, motherfucker!
All things considered, this was a strong and exciting opening roster of episodes that garnered Rick and Morty a devoted cult following instantly. Looking back with context of how far the show has gone, there's an endearing simplicity to season 1, with its silly plots and rooted B-stories. Episodes from later seasons often failed to have a secondary plot, much less one humble enough to be solely devoted to Jerry and Beth's domestic misadventures. The average IMDb user rating for Season 1 is 8.6, a fairly impressive score for the first season of any show. Unsurprisingly, Rick and Morty was renewed for a second season on Adult Swim 2 months before the first season finished airing. And 2 months after the finale, with the wind on their backs, Roiland and Harmon were already at the next Comic-Con, now with a much larger and more enthusiastic audience assimilated in front of them.
So did you guys all come here for this panel, or are you guys waiting for... Really? Wow.
All right, well then let's talk Season 2.
With a speed unimaginable to later Rick and Morty fans, they presented the gathered crowd with an animatic from Season 2.
Whoa.
The fans loved what they saw, and Roiland and Harmon went back to work propelled by their excitement. But with increased expectations came increased neuroticism from both the show's wild minds. And that wouldn't be the only hurdle they would have to overcome. In September 2014, animators working on Rick and Morty unionized due to the poor working conditions, including long hours and inadequate pay. This move was supported by the Animation Guild, which led to the artists ratifying a new labor agreement. Justin Roiland, however, reacted strongly against the union, going on a rant about the whole process on the Rick and Morty subreddit, saying, "The problem here is that the union went after the old studio, Starburns, and the new studio, Rick and Morty LLC, had no idea. By the time we found out about this, the union was strong-arming the crew to walk out. We had almost no time to put together a deal with the union. It was incredibly stressful and absolutely unnecessary. To put a deal together over a weekend is just nuts. We would have landed on just as good of a deal regardless of this gross time limit put upon us by the union. It left a really bad taste in my mouth. I also had no idea anyone was unhappy. No one told me anything. One minute it's just work as usual, the next minute there's a walkout. Okay, cool. Those union reps really know how to get people worked up and pissed off." Despite his objections to the process of how it happened, he did say later he was glad that the unionization improved the animators' working conditions, securing better wages and benefits for them.
That was like Justin kept saying, like, why can't they just go anywhere, do anything? Hey, I'm Justin Roiland. How come they can't just do a bunch of stuff and have everybody be a gleep glop or a gloop gloop?
It was during the production of Season 2 that the promise from the Simpsons crew for Roiland and Harmon to make a couch gag for them came into fruition, opening the Season 26 finale of the show, Mathlete's Feet. Matt Groening would later refer to it in an interview as the most ambitious and lengthy couch gag that the show had done. That's fair to say, given that the whole sequence ended up surpassing 2 minutes.
What I'll say is that the guys over there we got no creative notes. They were just so supportive and excited, and like we're killing the Simpsons, like we're splattering them everywhere. They loved it.
Although Harmon did the first pass-through of the script, the final product was mostly written by Justin, since the former had his hands full writing Season 2, along with the final season of Community. A month before the air date of Season 2's premiere, and 1 week before the creator's Comic-Con appearance, catastrophe struck when the first 2 episodes were leaked on Reddit. Roiland posted his response to the ordeal on the aforementioned forum site. "Just want to say that we have no idea who leaked these. We're bummed that they're leaked. Edit. Barack the President Obama leaked the episodes." Even though a year-long surprise had been spoiled at the 20-yard line, the silver lining for the team was that the episodes were very well received by the fans who passed them around.
Will evil Morty come back in Season 2?
Well, listen, here's what we'll say. Stay tuned.
And thus, Season 2 began.
That just sounds like slavery with extra steps.
Ooh la la, someone's gonna get laid in college.
The sophomore premiere, titled A Wrinkle in Time, officially released on July 26, 2015. Rick, Morty, and Summer find themselves in a quantum uncertainty after freezing time to clean up the house following the party in the previous finale, causing time to split into multiple realities. They struggle to synchronize the timelines while dealing with existential threats from being in a fragmented state. It earned 2.12 million viewers on Adult Swim, an impressive number for such a niche network. The decision to pick up the story right where the previous episode had left off was one that Harmon was resistant towards, but Roiland was adamant about. The writers initially struggled with the script because they had to invent new rules for a sci-fi concept instead of just subverting existing tropes with spoof plot lines like they had done before. Still, Justin's decision ended up being the right move, as the show essentially revealed off the bat that as irreverent and subversive as it enjoyed being, there was a narrative through line for viewers to follow. This was a balance that was struck perfectly in the first and second season, but would later become one of the causes for Rick and Morty's downfall. Season 2's second episode, titled Morty Night Run, the first to use Morty's name rather than Rick's, similarly invokes serialized elements, like the Galactic Federation from the pilot and Gearhead from Season 1. Rick takes Morty on a trip to teach him how to make a quick buck, but Morty ends up feeling guilty and saves a telepathic alien called Fart, slated for assassination. This was the introduction of Krombopolis Michael, who became a fan-favorite character nearly instantly, even though he died a few minutes after being introduced. As one YouTube commenter put it, Krombopolis Michael is like the Boba Fett of Rick and Morty. He doesn't have much screen time or lines, but all the fans love him. This episode also has the now iconic Roy sequence, in which Morty lives through an entire life in an ultra-realistic virtual reality arcade game. Another often cited example of early-era Rick and Morty experimenting with existential themes. Morty Night Run also contains a subtle link to a future plot, with a parasite pod seen in the rocks Rick collects, that goes on to incite the premise of the next big episode of the season. Total Recall often finds itself near the top of all-time lists. It is not a particularly important episode canonically, but rather a picture-perfect execution of a wacky sci-fi premise, squeezing every drop of potential out of it. The Smith family is besieged by alien parasites that implant them with fake memories, crowding the house with an ever-growing number of absurd characters, as they struggle to distinguish real people from imposters. Similar to what Harmon had already done in Community, this is a clip show spoof where none of the clips are from actual prior episodes. The concept led to one of Community's most beloved episodes, and it had the identical effect on Rick and Morty. This is also the introduction of Mr. Poopy Butthole, who would become one of the most cherished reoccurring characters on the show. The episode, tied with Season 4's The Vat of Acid episode, is the highest rated non-canon episode of the show by fans on IMDb. Critics were equally enthused, with reviewers from publications like Atlantic, Den of Geek, and IndieWire declaring Total Recall one of the strongest television offerings of 2015. There was some outrage online when it wasn't nominated for an Emmy, but it was somewhat expected given the show was still under the mainstream radar at the time. Interdimensional Cable 2 Tempting Fate is a direct follow-up to last season's Rick's D Minutes. This episode follows the Smith family as they watch more bizarre interdimensional TV shows while Jerry is taken to an alien hospital. This is the first entry of Rick and Morty to be viewed as poor by the vast majority of the fanbase, with many criticizing it for not living up to the standards set by the original outside of a standout performance by guest star Werner Herzog. The improvised interdimensional cable scenes lack the same punch as last season, leaving an unpleasant taste in the mouths of viewers. The next stop on our journey is the Season 2 finale, The Wedding Squanchers, which is the first canon-heavy episode of the show since last season's Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind. The Smith family is invited to the wedding of Bird Person and Tammy, only for it to be revealed as a trap by the Galactic Federation. The family is forced to go on the run, ending up on a distant planet. Rick, realizing his presence endangers his loved ones, turns himself in, leading to his imprisonment and the Federation taking control of Earth. This is a great episode in a lot of ways, but what's perhaps most noteworthy is the conclusion. After 20 episodes of having a silly, nonsensical story, the show managed to end its second season on a generally emotionally effective note. Looking back, this finale was nothing short of a miracle that would never again be repeated. Going back a little bit, shortly after the successful Season 2 premiere, Harmon and Roiland's show was renewed for a third. But there was a lot still to happen in the lead-up to this new batch of episodes. The first major development was Rick and Morty's expansion into video games. The show's first mobile experience was released on January 13th, 2016. Titled Pocket Mortys, it was a parody of the Pokemon series. Over time, Pocket Mortys expanded with new content, including multiplayer modes, special events, and additional Mortys, which was often advertised in promos that aired directly after new episodes. Pocket Mortys became a significant part of the Rick and Morty franchise, having accrued over 10 million players as the show's popularity exploded. In August of 2016, Roiland, seemingly inspired by working on Pocket Mortys, co-founded a VR video game development studio with Tanya Watson called Squatch Tendo. They would later rebrand to Squanch Games after the potential of legal troubles arose from the less than amused Nintendo. The studio would proceed to put out humorous, quirky, and often bizarre video games which reflected Roiland's distinct comedic style. But what about the TV show itself? Well, because its fan base was bigger than ever, it put enormous pressure on Roiland and Harmon to make the third season their best one yet. In an October interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Justin revealed that the team had started receiving several scripts from female writers for the upcoming season, which had never happened before. As he put it, "We've gone from having 0 spec scripts in the running from female candidates to having 5 or 6 of them. So it's looking very likely that season 3 will have 1, potentially 2 gals in the room." Whether or not this excuse of having never received spec scripts from women during the first 2 seasons was true or not, eventually 4 female writers joined the staff. While making the third round of scripts, the writers' room achieved gender balance, excluding the co-creators themselves. As you can probably tell, there was an adjustment period.
And one of the female writers said, very innocently, like she goes, "Oh, what if he's like one of those weird guys who likes to on women's faces and and there's a long beat, and all of a sudden Justin goes, yeah, those guys are weird."
Writing for the third series kicked off on November 2nd, 2015. Well, kicked off may be a strong term in this case. By July 2016, the production team was already falling behind schedule and acknowledged that the show's success had heightened pressure to meet viewers' expectations. Justin and Dan were unhappy with every script, constantly reworking the stories. The creative freedom granted by Adult Swim, while blessing, brought them and the team to the startling realization that they had to take full responsibility for whatever they ended up putting out next. San Diego Comic-Con 2016 rolled around in July. The creators, having very little from the upcoming season to present, improvised a story and showcased a Rick and Morty reenactment of a viral court case. This transcript reading achieved its own virality.
If on Monday week this happens again, you will not stay in the courtroom. Suck my sir. Okay. I'm subpoenaing y'all's ass in the courtroom.
But perhaps most exciting for fans in attendance was the sneak peek of a rough-cut animatic of an Old Boy-inspired action sequence from an upcoming episode where Rick turned himself into a pickle. This so-called Pickle Rick was all fans had to think about during the next several months of waiting. Hype for the episode reached unprecedented levels. In September 2016, the writing team had finally finished the new scripts and the animation process had begun. All in all, the writing for Season 3 took a little over a year to complete, which is an unheard of length of time for most television shows. Even after the animatics for each episode came back from the animation studio, additional passes on the scripts would follow. On April 1st, 2017, after months of radio silence regarding Season 3 updates, and a year and a half since the last episode had aired, a fan of the show tweeted to Dan Harmon begging for the show to return. Harmon responded, "What if I waved a magic wand and made the first episode from Season 3 premiere tonight? Is that what you would expect? Yes, that is exactly what I want, and everyone in the entire universe does too." Harmon responded, "Happy now, motherfucker?" As it would turn out, Adult Swim was pulling the most shocking April Fool's stunt of all time, surprise airing the Rick and Morty Season 3 premiere with zero notice whatsoever. The internet blew up with excitement at the audacious move.
Yeah, I'd like to get a 10-piece McNugget and a bunch of the Szechuan sauce.
The Rick Shank Rickdemption picked up from where the prior season's cliffhanger left off. Rick engineers an elaborate escape from prison, manipulating events to dismantle both the Galactic Federation and the Council of Ricks. He returns home, reunites with Morty and Summer, and frees Earth from the Federation control. Beth also divorces Jerry as her father's influence grows stronger over her. There's no question about it. This was a phenomenal way to kick off the season after a 2-year hiatus, surprise dropping an episode with fast pacing, non-stop action, serious lore drops, and strong comedic moments. Within its 23-minute runtime, audiences got a sneak peek into Rick's origin story, a check-in on the discarded universe from the first 6 episodes of the show, and a strong overhaul to the previous status quo. All things considered, this was really the only way to premiere the season, considering any trailer would have spoiled the outcome of the cliffhanger. The episode concludes with a reprise of the ending of the show's pilot, but this time with the deranged slobbering Rick ranting about an obscure 90s McDonald's menu item called Szechuan sauce.
And I'll go out and I'll find some more of that Mulan Szechuan teriyaki dipping sauce, Morty.
This may have been a funny non sequitur bit at the moment, but it would also go on to bite the show sooner rather than later. The surprise release of this premiere, combined with the high quality of the episode itself, injected the fan base with a rabid level of enthusiasm that would carry them all the way to July 30th, when Season 3 would begin properly.
I feel like we just want to make the best Season 3 we possibly could make, and I think in that we kind of vortexed into like a lot of, it's not good enough, it's not good enough, it's not good enough, rewriting, making it better.
In June of 2017, when production of the season had been completed, Harmon wrote a series of tweets where he refuted reports about his disagreements with Roiland being the main cause of the delay. Post-internet TV audiences are so used to finding out there's an intriguing, confusing, intense reason for delays. And Christ knows if you've ever seen my name on the internet, I've only got myself to blame for an association with intrigue, confusion, drama. As I speak, more articles are coming out about me and Justin fighting. It just happens to be hilariously not true even in the slightest. If you do know of me at all, you know that if Justin and I had ever fought, not only wouldn't we be able to keep it a secret, we'd be all too eager to share it with you. Also, that's not what would make the show slow down. Fighting probably would have been a good idea. It might have sped us up. Later reports would reveal there was some truth to the whispers that tension between Roiland and Harmon hindered the production of the show, but again, we'll get to that later. Either way, because development had taken so long, the 3rd season consisted of only 10 episodes instead of the initially intended 14. What followed was one of the most consequential years ever for Rick and Morty. In episode 2 of season 3, Rick and Morty and Summer traveled to a post-apocalyptic world reminiscent of Mad Max to escape their family issues. Because season 3 episode 1 was a surprise airing, this second episode acted as a de facto premiere of the season, and as such achieved the highest viewership of the show at 2.86 million, despite the fact that the actual content didn't exactly blow viewers away. Right off the bat, fans were confronted with some of the biggest problems of Season 3. For one, it just didn't feel like the same Rick and Morty. The dialogue was wordy and overly scripted. There were prolonged scenes exploring the emotional depths of the cast, and the genius silliness of the first 2 seasons appeared to have been entirely wiped out. Now, none of these are necessarily changes for the worse. Every show evolves with time, but it did ensure some serious whiplash for fans who had survived a 2-year drought. Episode 3, titled Pickle Rick, likely requires no introduction. Rick transforms himself into a pickle to get out of family therapy, leading to a series of dangerous and absurd adventures in which he battles rats and a secret Russian agency. Meanwhile, Beth, Morty, and Summer attend therapy with Dr. Wong, addressing their dysfunctional family dynamics. Rick eventually makes his way to the session and admits his avoidance, albeit in his own convoluted way. There was a lot of hype for this episode in the lead-up to its airing, since it had been one of the few things previewed back at San Diego Comic-Con 2016. Did the hype pay off? Well, that depends on who you ask. Right now, Pickle Rick sits at 9.2 on IMDb, has earned the #1 spot in many top 10 lists, and even won the show its first Emmy. On the other hand, many argue that this installment was terrible and humorless, with some going as far as to contend that the therapist was a self-insert character for writer of the episode Jessica Gao, theorizing that it was her ambition to enter the show through Dr. Wong and dress down Rick for his toxic masculinity. Rick's monologue on the sofa and her monologue responding to Rick's monologue is a true Rorschach test regarding your feelings for the season. If you enjoyed Season 3, you see an incisive analysis of our titular character's motivations, and a subsequent penetrating takedown of his nihilistic life philosophy. If you dislike Season 3, you see the show buying too much into its own hype, and offering nothing but sophistry in place of humor. But I personally just find it funny that he turned himself into a pickle. Pickle Rick also sets up what now has become the status quo of the show, namely that Rick is an all-powerful super genius who can do anything. The problem is that it did not at all match the flawed and dysfunctional Rick Sanchez that we had been accustomed to for the past few years. Rick in Seasons 1 and 2 was always flying by the seat of his pants, and rarely had contingency plans for when things would go wrong.
Morty, go get their shit. Hurry up. I only had one of those things I threw. I'm holding a box of Tic Tacs right now.
Far from the god-level status he began to inhabit from this point onward. With this change, a flawed character who audiences found to be genuinely cool and fun to root for was turned into someone who was constantly reminding viewers about his ability to do anything and everything. This decision would put the show between a rock and a hard place regarding how to write stories around Rick's character in later seasons. The next episode after Pickle Rick was Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender. Morty convinces Rick to team up again with the Vindicators, a group of intergalactic superheroes to take down their nemesis, World Ender. Rick reluctantly agrees, but shows open disdain for the group. The next morning, the team enters World Ender's base, only to discover that a blackout drunk Rick had already killed the villain the previous night, and set up a series of deadly puzzles for the heroes to solve. As the script states outright, this episode's plot is heavily inspired by the Saw movies. In spite of these inclusions, though, this was unfortunately another very poorly received episode by fans. To start, it further cements Rick as an all-powerful super being. Beyond that, the writing as a whole continued to prove far less sharp than in times past. Even with the lukewarm response, there was some unquestionably fun promotion surrounding it. In the lead up to its release, Adult Swim put out a preview of the creators talking up how important World Ender was as a new supervillain for the series, making his unceremonious off-screen death all the more humorous.
Boy, I'm getting spooked about thinking about World Ender right now. I mean, look at all those freckles.
In addition, Justin Roiland went method for the script, getting wasted off 4 or 5 glasses of tequila in order to play a drunken Rick. Episode 5, The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy, the duo face a series of conspiracies and assassination attempts, ultimately strengthening their bond. Meanwhile, Summer's body is supersized after tinkering with an alien machine, leading to a subplot about body image and self-esteem where Beth and Morty deal with the consequences of her transformation. After the shaky beginning of the season, this installment was essential in calming down a lot of uneasy fans. This sentiment was so largely felt that you can even find memes from the time on the subreddit reflecting what a respite the episode had provided to the fanbase. Something about the Whirly-Durly Conspiracy just felt like a return to form. It is still an unmistakably Season 3 episode in regards to all the time it spends on the dramatic elements of the show, but the characters felt more like themselves. The plot flowed better, and there were finally some of those moments of genuine comedic inventiveness that fans had come to expect. Many attributed this success to the fact that the script was written by veteran writer Ryan Ridley, while the past 3 episodes had all been penned by the new female hires, as a certain subset of the fan base would become increasingly vocal about. Proceeding in unremarkable episode 6, we have the Rick Lantis mix-up. In a cleverly deceptive cold open, which was the only aspect of this episode shown in previews, Rick and Morty head to the lost city of Atlantis. In a bit of a misdirection, however, this story's actual focus is revealed to be the Citadel of Ricks, depicting various stories and characters within its society. It explores political corruption, class struggle, and the lives of different Rick and Mortys in a segmented dystopian society. The episode culminates in a twist revealing evil Morty's rise to power. As many in the fandom have noted, this is an enormously impressive effort from Justin Roiland, since it's basically just 20 minutes of him talking to himself. But the excellence of this installment goes beyond the voice acting. This is still the highest rated episode of Rick and Morty on IMDb at 9.8 out of 10, and for good reason. The jokes hit, the storytelling is inventive, and it concludes with an impressive speech from a character that fans had waited several years to see return. The episode won the show the 2018 Annie Award for Outstanding Achievement, Writing, TV Broadcast Production. And even the biggest Pickle Rick defender would likely concede that this was the episode that should have been submitted for the Emmys in 2017. It was also vital in ensuring that Season 3 finally earned some goodwill from the fans. Up until this point, aside from the premiere, the best part of Season 3 was an episode that would have fit neatly as an average installment in the first couple years. This was the first time that the new season blew away viewers' expectations and actually surpassed the standards set by what had come before. In Episode 9, The ABCs of Beth, Rick and Beth revisit Fruipyland, a whimsical dimension Rick created for Beth during her adolescence. They discover that her childhood friend Tommy, presumed missing, had survived these past decades by turning feral. Beth confronts her dark tendencies and complex relationship with Rick. There's no way around it. This is an underwhelming episode. The script is overwritten and the jokes don't land. The premise, while full of potential, ends up being rather empty in terms of comedic sci-fi offerings. Perhaps the greatest mark against this one is a monologue by Rick in the third act that reaffirms what all the show's critics were alleging about the season. And a show where we used to get this.
Oh yeah, you gotta get Swifty.
We were now getting this.
Am I evil?
Worse, you're smart.
Self-important, faux intelligent, cringeworthy pontification about how smart people have a huge burden due to their genius realization that nothing really matters at all. Interestingly, in a preview before the season aired, Harmon perfectly refuted the concept of nihilism.
Do I agree with Rick that nothing means anything? No, I do not, because the knowledge that nothing matters, while accurate, gets you nowhere. The planet is dying, the sun is exploding, the universe is cooling, nothing's gonna matter. The further back you pull, the more that truth will endure. But when you zoom in on Earth, when you zoom into a family, when you zoom into a human brain and a childhood and experience, you see all these things that matter.
The problem is, when you make the antithesis of that argument come from the character your show has repeatedly deemed the smartest man in the universe, critics are going to naturally leap on that. The plot also ends with Rick offering Beth the chance to escape her suburban life and be replaced by an exact clone of herself to fulfill her family duties, concluding with the mystery of whether or not she accepted the proposition. A mystery that would be immediately followed up in the next episode and the finale of the season, Episode 10, The Rick-Churian Morty Date. To wrap up this turbulent junior year, Rick and Morty clash with the President of the United States over trivial tasks, leading to a series of escalating confrontations. Their antics strain the relationship with the government, resulting in a high-stakes showdown at the White House. Meanwhile, Beth questions her identity, suspecting she might be a clone Rick created, which exacerbates her already fragile relationship with Jerry. The episode ends with the family happy to be together again, except for Rick, who is disappointed about losing his dominant position. Obviously, this was a disappointing finale for fans who were hyped up from the Evil Morty reintroduction from Episode 7, and expecting some huge progression for the overarching narrative. The whole thing ends with more of a whimper than a bang, with the family all back together again, and verbal declarations that the status quo had been reset and that the next set of stories would be just like the old days. This begs the question, why devote the entire season to character development when you were just going to undo the whole thing in the finale? Mr. Poopy Butthole returns in the post-credits scene, pouring salt on the wound by telling fans that they would have to wait a really long time for the next season. Even all these years later, Season 3 stands out as an odd outlier in the show for how seriously it takes a story and serialization. Despite having a lot more haters than seasons past, it still represented the pinnacle of fan excitement, and as such has an average IMDb user score of 8.7, the same as Season 2. Which leads into this point that many often forget when critiquing the season. Season 3's run, by any objective measure, was Rick and Morty at its cultural peak. Its viewership was at the highest it ever had been or would be. It received more awards than years prior, and it truly captured the zeitgeist of the moment. It was everywhere, from shirts to plushies to bongs to hats to condoms to more bongs. It took the show's plot incredibly seriously, which would have been a fine direction to go, but many OG fans thought it just didn't have anywhere near the same level of wit that the first two seasons did. As I've already mentioned, many of the fans placed the blame at the feet of the new female writers, going so far as to target them for penning their least favorite episodes. Harmon, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, went to bat defending the female additions to the staff. "I've made no bones about the fact that I loathe these people. It f***ing sucks. And the only thing I can say is if you're lucky enough to make a show that is really good that people like, that means some bad people are going to like it too. I want to scream at my computer, you idiots, we all write the show together. If you can tell the difference between one writer and another on a show I'm running, I've probably gone so lazy that it hasn't all been blended and refined in the usual process." But the sexism exhibited in certain parts of the fan base was not what turned the internet against the show. Rather, it started to buckle under the weight of its own fan base as millions started to flock to the program. And of course, with such large numbers, cringe was inevitably going to follow. It all began when Rick and Morty's third season dealt the new pop culture icon its hardest backlash yet, in regards to its reputation due to one joke from the premiere.
"Yeah, I'd like to get a 10-piece McNugget and a bunch of the Szechuan sauce."
This brief reference brought huge online attention from the fan base towards McDonald's discontinued promotional product. Internet memes spread rapidly on Twitter and Reddit, and more than 40,000 people signed an online petition on change.org, asking for the return of the Asian-inspired sauce, while an eBay auction resulted in a 20-year-old packet being sold for nearly $15,000. Although I need to add that that is probably not true and the person never actually paid. Eventually, in the wake of all this excitement, McDonald's announced that on October 7th, 2017, they would be serving limited quantities of Szechuan sauce at select locations. But what should have been a moment of financial success and fan celebration ended up backfiring horribly, as the fast food company severely underestimated how many people would be attracted to the promotion. As a result, fans were left waiting for hours in long lines, only to discover the restaurants had already run out of sauce by the time they got to place their order. The entire ordeal prompted enraged reactions by disappointed fans, with some tantrums so disruptive that the police had to get involved. This was not a great look for McDonald's, but it was a far worse look for Rick and Morty enjoyers. The next day, the burger chain released a statement on the catastrophe that was their rollout, saying, "To our customers and Szechuan sauce lovers, yesterday we were truly humbled by the amazing curiosity, passion, and energy this community showed to welcome back Szechuan sauce. Even if just for one day, thank you a million times over." Between the costumes, the memes, and the cross-state travel, you, the fans, showed us what you got. And our super limited batch, though well-intentioned, clearly wasn't near enough to meet that demand. Not cool.
Everyone's safety, guys, and your safety is not worth a thing of sauce.
We agree, so we're gonna make this right. In the last 24 hours, we've worked to open any portal necessary, and it worked. Szechuan sauce is coming back once again this winter, and instead of being one day only and limited to select restaurants, we're bringing more, a lot more, so that any fan who's willing to do whatever it takes for Szechuan sauce will only have to ask for it at a nearby McDonald's. We want to make this right. You're some of the best fans in this, or any dimension, and we plan to deliver on that promise as soon as possible. Stay tuned.
Uncle Rick! 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 I'm Pickle Rick! Rick!
I'm sure this isn't the first time you've seen that infamous video. In fact, it's quite possibly the most damaging thing to ever happen to Rick and Morty's reputation. What's particularly funny is that the provocateur in it, known as Chairman Mar on YouTube, didn't even watch the show and was just attempting satire. But Poe's Law made him the Rick and Morty fan in the eyes of millions, and his obnoxious display was a kill shot for the show's standing. Rick and Morty's name became synonymous with its toxic fandom. And it wasn't just the Szechuan sauce. With a spike in popularity, the show had drawn an army of online devotees, fedora-wearing nerds who identified with the main character, describing themselves as real Ricks and consolidating in Facebook groups. Here are some of the questions posed. What is your opinion on the human race, and how isolation and/or social interaction be of benefit to humanity? Again, answer as concise and insightful as possible. Personal question. Has a woman ever been intimidated by your intelligence and gone out with a Jerry instead? I imagine these people who identified themselves as real-life Mortys were the type to get bad grades in school because they had a different type of intelligence. If you were on the internet in 2017, the following copy pasta is likely burned into your memory. To be fair, you have to have a very high IQ to understand Rick and Morty. The humor is extremely subtle, and without a solid grasp on theoretical physics, most of the jokes will go over a typical viewer's head. There's also Rick's nihilistic outlook, which is deftly woven into his characterization. The fans understand this stuff. They have the intellectual capacity to truly appreciate the depths of these jokes, to realize that they're not just funny, they say something deep about life. As a consequence, people who dislike Rick and Morty truly are idiots. Of course, they wouldn't appreciate, for example, the humor in Rick's existential catchphrase, wubba-lubba-dub-dub, which itself is a cryptic reference to Turgenev's Russian epic Fathers and Sons. I'm smirking right now just imagining one of those addle-pated simpletons scratching their heads in confusion as Dan Harmon's genius unfolds itself on their television screens. What fools. How I pity them. And yes, by the way, I do have a Rick and Morty tattoo. And no, you cannot see it. It's for the ladies' eyes only. And even they have to demonstrate that they're within 5 IQ points of my own, preferably lower, beforehand. If people screaming Pickle Rick was the most damaging thing to happen to Rick and Morty's reputation, this was a close second. Seemingly overnight, it went from a niche hit program to an embarrassing cartoon only annoying people associated with. Akin to something like Steven Universe or Sonic the Hedgehog in the eyes of the mainstream. Its fall from the cool kids club was quick and brutal.
So you like Rick and Morty, huh?
Yeah.
I got into it because of my son, but now I love it too.
Wubba-lubba-dub-dub.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Now, every mention of the show came with an asterisk. Everyone knew that these people did not represent the entirety of the Rick and Morty fanbase, but they certainly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. And for me, it was simply fun to imagine that they all acted this way. Even Justin Roiland felt the need to comment on it, posting on Twitter, "Bad can be found in every sample group of humanity. I have personally seen more good than bad in the R&M fanbase. I'm gonna focus on good." In the real world, the show's popularity had skyrocketed during Season 3, but in the online world, however, hundreds of video essays came out deriding the season, declaring the show's magic was gone. It was bigger than ever, and at the same time, had a weaker aura than it ever did, and thus was seen as the end of peak Rick and Morty. The post-credits scene of the Season 3 finale left fans with an acute sense of hopelessness, and true to Poopy Butthole's word, the show would not be back for a very, very long time. Things were eerily quiet in the wake of the 3rd season. Months passed without so much as a whisper on the future of the internet's favorite series. Then in January of 2018, a scandal struck. Dan Harmon, reflecting on the previous year's earth-shaking Me Too movement, tweeted out on New Year's Day, "This was truly the year of the asshole, myself included. We don't have to make 2018 the year of the mensch, but I hope it can be the year of the not as much of an asshole. #realistic goals." In response to this, in a post that raised a lot of eyebrows, former community writer Megan Gans quote-tweeted him with the message, "Care to be more specific?" Dan Harmon replied a day later, "I didn't want to add narcissism to injury by naming you without permission, but I've talked on my podcast about the lines I crossed. I will talk about it more in any way that you think is just. I am deeply sorry. I'm filled with regret and a lot of foggy memories about abusing my position, treating you like garbage. I would feel a lot of relief if you told me there was a way to fix it. I'll let you call the shots. Till then, at least know I was an awful boss and a selfish baby." Gans responded, "You want relief? So do I. I want to watch the first episode of television I wrote again without remembering what came after. Figure out how to give me that relief and I'll return the favor." Harmon replied, "I'm disgusted and sorry that I stained our show and your talent with my selfish, childish shit. I get that I can't erase it, don't want to, but have felt sick about it. I'll reiterate, if and when you want me to do something, a public letter, a cosign on your letter, a book, pamphlet, public whatevering, I will support it. I will nod. I will verify. I will suffer and atone." Megan fired back, I appreciate your attempts to make amends and your acknowledgement of fault. That doesn't sound as tidy as I forgive you, but that's not my feeling yet. I'm working towards it all the time, for my benefit more than yours. This was a tense period to say the least, and with this vague exchange, Dan Harmon's name was trending all over the news, and for a while it looked like he would be the next male celebrity to be vanquished from the industry due to misconduct. 4 days after the initial Twitter exchange, Harmon spoke on his podcast to atone for his sins and poured his soul out, confessing every detail of what he put Megan through.
And so I did the cowardly, easiest, laziest thing you could do with feelings like that, and I didn't deal with them. And in not dealing with them, I made everybody else deal with them. I broke up with my girlfriend, then I went right full steam into creeping on my employee. So I just want to say, in addition to obviously being sorry, I did it by not thinking about it. And I got away with it by not thinking about it. And if she hadn't mentioned something on Twitter, I would have continued to not have to think about it.
This confession would lead to a truly singular moment in the Me Too era. After hearing Harmon's podcast, Megan Gans responded publicly, accepting his apology. The series of tweets reads as follows. Here's a weird one for you. Last week, I called out my former boss for sexual harassment, and today I'm going to ask you to listen to his podcast. This was never about vengeance. It's about vindication. That's why it didn't feel right to just accept his apology in private, although I did that too. Because if any part of this process should be done in the light, it's the forgiveness part. And so, Dan, I forgive you. In the end, the story concluded as well as it could have for all parties involved. Gans continued her career in television, writing and producing, moving on to successful shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. She was praised for her courage in speaking out and for the grace with which she handled the situation. But this would not be the last time Harmon's name was tied up in scandal. After a few months, it became clear that contract negotiations with Adult Swim were making it so that Rick and Morty had not gotten picked up for future episodes just yet. And the creators were starting to get as annoyed as the audience. On March 17th, Harmon tweeted, I hear ya, tough spot. On one hand, it can be challenging, especially with crippling lazy alcoholism, to write a show that hasn't been ordered by a network. On the other hand, the thought that fans like you pay the price, I'm gonna grab a drink. On March 21st, Roiland echoed a similar sentiment on his Twitter, posting, For everyone telling me to get back to work on Rick and Morty Season 4, turn your attention to Turner. I'm waiting around just like you, making some cool video games in the meantime though. After these tweets was another drought of public information. Everyone knew that the show would get renewed, but the length of time it was taking to get there was making the fan base's patience wear thin. On May 10th, 2018, Adult Swim announced a long-term deal with the creators of Rick and Morty that included an order for 70 more episodes, making a total of 100. The news was broken by Justin Roiland when he tweeted a doodle announcing the unprecedentedly huge renewal with the caption, More Rick and Morty coming. Looking forward to all the tweets asking where it is. Hashtag they drawin' it. The announcement also led to the reveal that Kanye West was a fan of Rick and Morty as he posted in response, This is the greatest news. This is my favorite show. I've seen every episode at least 5 times each. Still, details on Season 4's release were notably absent, but in the writer's room, things were anything but silent. In July of 2018, trolls on 4chan and R the Donald were feeling their oats after getting James Gunn fired from Disney by resurfacing his old tweets. On the hunt for their next Hollywood liberal to target with their past edgy content, they landed on none other than Dan Harmon, who at the time was tweeting nonstop against the Trump presidency. And unfortunately for the writer, the video they chose was a doozy. What you have to understand is that in 2009, Harmon had produced a short pilot for Channel 101 titled Daryl, a dark parody on the popular TV show Dexter, where the main character is a serial killer with a moral code. In Harmon's sketch, the titular Daryl was depicted as a therapist who sexually abused babies, implying that that was his way of coping with trauma. And the video features a pretty unrealistic and vulgar emulation of the assault. It didn't gain much attention at the time, and was quickly forgotten. When the video was brought to everyone's screen in the year 2018, however, the response was a lot louder than Harmon likely ever envisioned for the half-baked skit. The sketch provoked widespread outrage, with the condemnation across the internet for its disturbing content. Many people were horrified by the depiction of child abuse, even though the baby in question was just a doll and it was all done in the name of satire. Across the internet, allegations of pedophilia were launched against Rick and Morty's co-creator. Following the broad backlash, Dan Harmon issued a public apology, acknowledging that the sketch was ill-advised. Nobody should ever have to see what you saw, and for that, I sincerely apologize. The outrage was so loud for this video that Adult Swim felt the need to release a statement on their own. At Adult Swim, we seek out and encourage creative freedom and look to push the envelope in many ways, particularly around comedy. The offensive content of Dan's 2009 video that recently surfaced demonstrates poor judgment and does not reflect the type of content we seek out. Dan recognized his mistake at the time and has apologized. He understands there is no place for this type of content here at Adult Swim. Shortly after the scandal, Dan Harmon deleted his Twitter account, which was probably for the best. This whole ordeal did nothing to derail the Rick and Morty train though. In May of 2019, the show released the first promotion of the new season, revealing that the premiere would be the same year in November. This was an incredibly bare-bones video, and what seemed to be a troll for all the Easter egg hunting YouTube channels that squeeze content out of every second of new Rick and Morty footage. On July 19th, the show unveiled the first look into the season with a 1-minute clip from the episode The Old Man and the Seat, showing Morty interrogating a chubby alien. In August, Kanye West visited the Rick and Morty studio wearing a costume hoodie that featured the show's art style, and plans for an episode featuring the controversial superstar were discussed. On November 7th, the official trailer for the season premiered, featuring some provocative imagery such as Morty wearing a Nazi uniform. Perhaps the biggest reveal of the trailer, however, was the announcement at the very end that only 5 episodes would air before an indefinite break. This was the first bit of disappointment that fans would be enduring from this season, and it would not be the last.
You will go where I want you to go!
Season 4 represented a steep course correction from Season 3. They received the response from viewers loud and clear. The serialized, overly scripted episodes were not what they wanted. Unfortunately, the creators veered too far in the opposite direction this time around. As Emmy Magazine reported after an interview with Harmon back in August of 2018, the philosophy of the writer's room had changed. Rather than focus on A and B stories and certain jokes and bits of dialogue that might fit together, Harmon and his team will instead develop, nurture, and cultivate ideas, moments, conversations, joke stories, premises, and swaths of dialogue, with no emphasis on any one aspect over another. It's a sort of deconstruction of the process, focusing on moments first and structure second, rather than the other way around, that is, the usual way. This explains a lot about the episodes that followed. On November 10th, 2019, the season of Rick and Morty premiered. While the show already had a tradition of several episode titles being Rick and Morty's name infused with famous pieces of media, it officially got incredibly out of hand here. The first example of this being Episode 1, Edge of Tom Morty, Rick Die Rick Pete. In the premiere, Rick takes Morty on a mission to harvest crystals that show their holders all possible ways they could die. Morty becomes obsessed with ensuring he follows a path to his longest and most ideal life possible, leading to increasingly reckless and destructive behavior. On the other side of things, Rick repeatedly dies and is reborn in alternate realities, each time finding himself in a different and often hostile environment. While this episode does some things right, it ultimately does one huge thing wrong. As you may have already guessed, that one thing is its total scrambling of the show's stakes by eschewing the concept of death for Rick. If you thought the previous season went too far in making him an unstoppable force, this one literally kicks off with establishing the fact that Rick cannot die. This did a lot of damage to the stakes of every story to follow, since any danger the main character could possibly face was now null and void, setting a very bad precedent for the season to come. In the following episode, Rick discovers someone has used his private toilet and embarks on a quest for vengeance, revealing his deep-seated need for solitude and control. Meanwhile, Jerry develops an app with an alien that wreaks havoc by matching people with their ideal matches, leading to societal chaos. This episode displays the first sign of Season's 4 new visual direction, with many uninterrupted long shots in which extended exchanges of dialogue play out. These may have seemed artsy and cool during the storyboarding, but many fans felt the lack of editing messed with the comedic timing of certain scenes. The script also goes for an emotional ending that simply doesn't feel earned from the story it's attached to, concluding with Tony, the person who used Rick's private toilet, dying. Rick is supposedly sad about the death of his new friend/toilet rival, but the episode does a poor job of firmly establishing the sparks of an actual kinship between the two. Next up in Claw and Hoarder Special Rickdom Morty, Morty receives a dragon who ends up bonding with Rick instead, leading to jealousy and conflict. The adventure escalates as they encounter a fantasy world of magic, betrayal, and strange sexual undertones. Meanwhile, Jerry becomes entangled with a talking cat played by guest star Matthew Broderick, leading to bizarre and dark revelations. This episode is notable in that it was immediately seen by many as the worst the show had to offer when it dropped. For proof of this, look no further than the post-episode discussion on the show subreddit. "That was the worst Rick and Morty episode I have seen. The pacing seemed off, the jokes lacked any subtlety. It just felt like someone else wrote it." With that said, I could absolutely see the events of this episode playing into future episodes, which could elevate this episode on rewatches. But man, I just did not enjoy that. The cat's repeated refrain to Jerry very clearly represents the writer's room motto in Season 4. Don't think, just have fun. Unfortunately, just because something is fun to create, doesn't mean it's fun for others to watch. In Rattlestar Ricklactia, Rick and Morty find themselves in a time-traveling serpent society after Morty is bitten by a space snake. Their actions set off a series of events leading to an apocalypse, forcing Rick to intervene in increasingly convoluted ways. Meanwhile, Jerry's attempts at independence backfire comically as he gets stuck in the air with a snake stuck to his leg. This episode, slightly carried by the hype of Justin Roiland declaring it his favorite of the first batch of the season on Twitter, was received fairly positively by the fans. It was significant for the show in that it was the first time Rick and Morty ever used time travel since the writers had sworn it off when they began writing the show 6 years prior. This installment won back some favor with the fans, particularly with the return of Time Cops from the Season 2 premiere. Still, it wasn't as good as the final episode before another indefinite break probably ought have been. And after 2 years of waiting, being served a small handful of episodes that were just pretty good and then being told to wait some more was not best for fan morale. Ratings were down from Season 3, and the ubiquitous hype that the show was generating from that time had now dissipated entirely. During the mid-season break, Solar Opposites was released, a show co-created by Justin Roiland. It was essentially to Rick and Morty what American Dad was to Family Guy, carrying the same art style and sense of humor as its sister show, but with a slightly different tone and goal. For many fans, Solar Opposites was a breath of fresh air, a respite from a show that had to meet exceedingly high expectations, and only managed to serve up disappointment. It was in this gap that Rick and Morty also earned their first Super Bowl ad with their collaboration with Pringles.
Stack Pringles flavors. Make new ones.
How much do you think Pringles paid these people?
Hardly anything.
On April 1st, 2020, the trailer for The Other Five dropped. Because of the date, many people wondered if the footage depicted here was a joke. Even with these doubts, though, fans could not help but get excited, with what appeared to be a return of longtime favorite characters like Snowball and Tammy, as well as a CGI shot of an army of Ricks. All of these scenes would turn out to actually be included in the mid-season premiere, Never Ricking Morty, which aired on May 7th. Now, a few titles tend to get brought up when the question is raised of, what is the worst episode of Rick and Morty? Most will name something from Season 5, which we'll be getting to soon. Others say the Dragon episode. Some may even say Pickle Rick for how popular it became and made the show toxic. An episode you rarely hear brought up, however, is Never Ricking Morty. But the fact of the matter is, the wreckage this one installment caused in the series is unparalleled. The mid-season premiere begins seeming like it's going to be a parody of the film Snowpiercer. The only difference being that all the characters speak about the time that they met Rick Sanchez. This premise is a funny and interesting idea for an anthology episode, but things quickly take a turn for the worse when it's revealed that our protagonists are actually Rick and Morty. The story train is a literal narrative device, and that the plot is going to revolve around self-indulgent meta-deconstructions of TV writing for the next 20 minutes, at least in some people's opinion. This is the moment where it became markedly evident that the show was now willing to rely heavily on breaking the fourth wall anytime they became insecure with their writing. While some of the ideas the episode explores are almost entertaining, it truly sticks a middle finger to its audience with its ending, where our characters are forced by a villain, Story Lord, to endure several different ways the show's canon could develop. All the footage that the fans were excited for in the previous trailer is this part. It concludes with Rick saying,
"We got all that meta canon shit out of the way, and now we can just be ourselves,"
directly signaling to fans that the show was abandoning its canon elements. Now remember, this is the episode that came after a 6-month hiatus that followed 5 middling stories, which themselves took 2 years to release. This was the reward fans got for waiting. Rick and Morty was not just mocking fans' investment and excitement, but outright rejecting it and declaring their hands washed of all that they had built up over the years. Back in 2013, in a Reddit AMA, Dan Harmon answered the question, "Why do you think Community and Rick and Morty have such devoted fandoms?" And looking back on it, it's an answer that perfectly articulates why this episode was a terrible move on the show's behalf. Nobody that worked on Community or that works on Rick and Morty had the capacity to regard the show as unimportant. People that feel that way quit, and I think you can feel through the screen that if you were to approach someone working on Rick and Morty with a costume or a tattoo, or a question that indicated that Rick and Morty was your life, you wouldn't risk that person going, "Ew, you got a Rick and Morty tattoo?" The shows I like, and the shows I like to think I make, are shows whose wildest dream is to be studied, loved, analyzed, etc. Maybe I'm looking a little too hard into this, but I believe Never Rick and Morty was crafted in a lab to punish obsession. While it would later be revealed that the show was not abandoning its overarching story, many fans at the time responded to this episode by taking it at its word, and some saying things such as, "I feel like they hate making this show." Obviously, not everyone felt this way, with the other side of the fandom arguing that caring about canon was the wrong way to watch. The mentality of this episode split the audience down the middle, and to this day, arguments still rage throughout the fan base between people who care about the lore and those who just want goofy, episodic fun. What once was a program about sci-fi, nihilism, and existentialism was now a show about itself, which was a decision that really began to alienate longtime dedicated viewers. Moving on to Season 4, Episode 8, we have Rick involved in an elaborate scheme involving a fake vat of acid. This leads to a falling out with Morty, who demands a more useful invention. Rick creates a save point device that allows Morty to reset time, leading to a series of reckless and tragic escapades. This was an instant hit with fans and critics alike, many calling it the best episode since Rick-Atlantis Mix-Up. What really cemented its quality status was the fantastic dialogue-free 5-minute montage of Morty playing with the rewind device, which takes several twists and turns, concluding with one of the biggest emotional gut punches in the show. It is a masterclass in dark comedy, even though the only reason it exists at all is because the episode's runtime came in a few minutes short and they had to elongate the montage. The Vat of Acid episode earned the show its second Emmy, and unlike Pickle Rick, pretty much every Rick and Morty fan agrees that the victory was well-deserved. This season's finale sees the return of Space Beth, leading to a confrontation between her and her loved ones over her true identity and Rick's role in their lives. The family faces a series of high-stakes battles against the Galactic Federation, culminating in a showdown that forces Beth to confront her feelings about Rick and her place in the family. Rick's manipulations and secrets come to light, leading to a moment of self-reflection and vulnerability. The finale represents a lot of the negative qualities of Season 4, the main one being the countless meta comments that dissipate the stakes of the episode, and many fans found it frustrating how many times the story paused so the writers could seemingly speak directly to the audience about how they didn't want to be doing this. On the other hand, they at least managed to get a genuinely sincere ending out of it despite the constant fourth wall breaks. Truth be told, this episode acts as a better finale to Season 3 than to Season 4, addressing things like Phoenix Person, Dr. Wong, and the mind-blowing device, all of which were plot lines that were set up in the previous season. They were going for a fake-out with Episode 6 of the season, where they made all the fans believe that they didn't care about the show's canon, and then they brought it back with this installment. The only issue with this kind of misdirection is that you leave your entire fan base to argue for weeks that they don't actually care about the plot in order to cope with the slap in the face. Still, a fairly decent conclusion to a heavily divisive batch of episodes. The average IMDb user rating for Season 4 is 8.4, the lowest yet, although not by much. Not a lot happened between Rick and Morty Season 4 and 5. For the first time in the show's history since Season 2's airing, they took a regular-sized gap between seasons, returning just a little over a year later. It seems that after a half-decade, the writing room finally hit a stride of getting work done on time. During this break, Rick and Morty showed up in other media, further trying to assert its dominance over popular culture. On June 8, 2021, 12 days before the premiere of Season 5, Rick was added to Fortnite as a playable character. On July 16, 2021, in a cameo that took place in the midst of the Season 5's airing but was certainly recorded prior to it, Rick and Morty made a cameo appearance in Space Jam 2 to drop off the Tasmanian Devil. In terms of the creator's other ventures, Roiland released his first NFT collection during this time, which sold for over $1.65 million. He also sold his first painting via Sotheby's auction this year. Season 4's Blu-ray, which released in September 2020, was the first to not feature a commentary track for the episodes, signaling to fans the creator's growing detachment from the show. For reasons unknown at the time, Roiland broke from tradition and did not join Harmon for any promotional interviews or panels, a noticeable departure from previous years. Fans initially brushed it off, assuming he was tied up with his new projects. Little did they know, a more somber reality lay beneath this shift. But who had time to dig deeper? After all, Season 5 of Rick and Morty was just around the corner.
I have a pubescent memory of my older self in my closet. Gotta deal with that. That could get ugly.
To start Season 5 with a bang, Rick and Morty crash into the ocean, provoking the ire of Rick's old nemesis, Mr. Nimbus. Nimbus arrives for dinner with the Smith household to negotiate peace, creating tension and chaos. Meanwhile, Morty attempts to impress his crush, Jessica, but his efforts lead to unintended consequences involving a time-accelerated dimension. The premiere was nothing short of exceptional. In a bold move, Adult Swim uploaded the episode directly to YouTube, where it quickly racked up over 13 million views, although it has since been removed. The episode captures the classic Rick and Morty vibe, delivering a clever sci-fi plot that keeps viewers hooked from start to finish. The pacing is lightning fast, a hallmark of the series, but this time it hinted at the even more frenetic storytelling that would define Season 5. In Episode 3, A Rick Convenient Mort, Morty embarks on a whirlwind romance with an environmentalist superhero named Planetina, but his idealistic view of love clashes with the harsh realities of her responsibilities and the world's problems. Meanwhile, Rick and Summer go on a wild adventure to various apocalyptic planets, indulging in reckless hedonism. This episode, which tackles the pain of young heartbreak, was Dan Harmon's Emmy shot for the season, which makes it no coincidence that the Community actress Alison Brie was chosen for the role of the female superhero. Despite the pedigree of the creative talent behind the scenes and the clear effort put into the script though, it unfortunately received a much more tepid response than Harmon probably hoped for. Critics and audiences both praised it, but one can't help but wonder if it would have been hailed much more widely had it been made a few years prior, before Rick and Morty's popularity began slipping. In the next episode, Morty's ill-advised use of a horse breeding mount leads to the creation of mutant sperm creatures that threaten the world. Rick and the family must deal with the grotesque consequences of Morty's actions, culminating in a bizarre and outrageous battle against the monsters. Ask any Rick and Morty fan what the all-time worst episode is, and 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you the one with the giant mutant sperm. It's not hard to see why. To start off, the humor leaves a lot to be desired, with the whole thing even ending on Rick clicking a Staples "that was easy" button as its conclusionary punchline, and a writing choice ripped straight from the pages of Smosh videos from 2010. But the thing that really cemented this episode's negative reputation is the plot's conclusion. To make a long story short, Morty's mutant sperm end up fertilizing one of Summer's eggs, leading to the birth of a giant incest baby who gets shot into space. Here are the top comments on the Reddit discussion post to gauge the general fan reaction to the episode in question. I'm just gonna say it. Morty and Summer canonically having a child is just f***ing weird and kinda gross. Not funny. This was the most repulsive and unenjoyable shit ever. Like, if in 2 years Dan Harmon reveals they were doing a prank and trying to write the worst episode of Rick and Morty without telling anyone, I would not be surprised at all. Jesus Christ, it just kept getting worse. Even in the behind-the-scenes look, the creator seemed utterly embarrassed by what they had put out.
Random left turns like underground horse people sometimes is the only evidence that you're having fun.
I think it turned out disgusting and tasteless.
This was when people took note of the writer's obsession with incest, even going back to previous eras and noting more and more examples of it that had previously been overlooked. These fans also took notice of other questionable dialogue choices from past episodes, such as multiple instances of Summer talking about wetting herself. If the reputation of being cringe wasn't bad enough, the Rick and Morty crew now had to contend with being viewed as sexual deviants by a portion of their audience. The episode marked a new low for Rick and Morty, and single-handedly ended the honeymoon that the season was enjoying. The goodwill that they had acquired with fans had been wiped out, which can be observed by the fact that the following 2 episodes, both of which were fairly mild installments, were also given historically low ratings on IMDb. The fans were no longer accepting watchable. At this point, the mainstream really didn't care about Rick and Morty at all, while many hardcore fans started to hate watching it, whether justified or not. The incest baby would later return to the season's 7th episode, in a huge indication of the writer's inability to predict what their fan base would be responsive towards. Rick and Morty had clearly hit a massive stumbling block, and it would take something big to win back the audience. Next up, let's talk about episode 8, where Rick enters Bird Person's mind to save him, navigating through his memories and their shared past. The journey reveals previously unseen depths of Rick's history and his hidden vulnerabilities. This was a monumental episode for the show in terms of lore, since it confirmed a longtime fan theory that the Rick we follow didn't have a Beth of his own. In any other season, this reveal combined with the clever format of the story overall would have been received overwhelmingly positive and instantly regarded as a classic. But the aftertaste of what had come before was still lingering in the mouths of viewers, causing the reception to still fall a tad short. That being said, this is a genuinely solid episode at a time when the show desperately needed it. After episode 8, there was a 2-week break. During this time, Adult Swim released a live-action promotion for Rick and Morty featuring Christopher Lloyd as Rick. This left many fans confused as to whether or not it was just a one-time thing or if some big movie was going to be announced. As it turned out, it was just a one-time thing. Finally, the 2-part season finale premiered on September 5th, 2021, with episode 9 and 10. In this finale, our protagonists have a confrontation with Evil Morty, who reveals his master plan to break free from the central finite curve, a construct that confines all realities in which Rick is the smartest man alive. As Rick and Morty face the implications of Evil Morty's actions, they confront the deeper truths about their universe and relationship. This episode does most things right. It features the long-awaited return of Evil Morty and gives a genuinely impactful send-off to his character, concluding the episode on a strong cliffhanger regarding the future of the show. It also has the highest stakes of any episode since the ill-advised decision in the Season 4 premiere to eschew death. In fact, the specific plot point is actually addressed here and erased as a possible contingency plan. Of course, this episode still has the self-defense fourth wall breaking that fans had gotten sick of from Season 5. This was especially disappointing since it goes so in-depth with Rick's backstory, and many fans felt that the desire to undercut all of that with meta jokes came off as very insecure on the part of the writers. The average IMDb user rating for this season is 7.7, a noticeable drop-off from previous years that reflected how fans were feeling about the series as a whole. In the end, this is really when the viewers turned on the show's quality. But even though the precedent-smashing ratings of Season 3 had dwindled by this point, Rick and Morty was still generating hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise for Adult Swim, meaning the train would still continue chugging along. Not much of note occurred during the break between seasons this time around. A prequel Vindicators webseries, created by the writers of their debut episode, was released on YouTube to middling reviews. Following that, with minimal fanfare, came Season 6 on September 4th, 2022.
Why are you here? Buddy, I have been asking myself that exact same question.
There are really only 2 episodes of this new batch worth talking about, the premiere and the finale. Episode 1, Solar Ricks, this time around, is an incredibly canon-heavy return to the series and a pretty competent one at that. Picking up right where the show left off, the Smith family finds themselves stranded in their original realities, each dealing with their own challenges. Rick tries to reunite the family and fix the multiverse, leading to a series of adventures and confrontations with old enemies. The episode introduces Rick Prime as the new main antagonist of the show, and confirms the longtime fan theory that the Morty we have been following this whole time was Rick Prime's grandson all along. For all intents and purposes, this was a fairly successful episode in terms of expanding the lore and hitting the proper emotional beats, even flipping the nonsense Rick and Morty 100 years refrain from past premieres into a sentimental moment between the two title characters. This episode also marks the show's grand maneuver towards larger family escapades rather than just following the titular characters on classic-type adventures, which it largely stuck to for the rest of the season. In the finale named Richtnational Mortpoons Rickmas Mortcation, the Smith family's Christmas takes a chaotic turn when Morty receives a lightsaber from Rick. After accidentally dropping the weapon vertically, it threatens to destroy Earth, leading to a wild adventure involving the real Rick, a robotic decoy, and a battle with the President. All things considered, it's a relatively tame episode that ends with Rick revealing his obsession quest to hunt down Rick Prime, setting up a major storyline for the next season. None of the episodes were standouts, but none of them approached the poor quality of the infamous 4-episode run during Season 5 either, marking it as a rather unremarkable period of the series. The real standout during this era would turn out to be the shenanigans behind the scenes. 3 days after the Season 6 finale, Squanch Games released High on Life, a first-person shooter set in a bizarre alien universe, where players use talking sentient guns, each with their own annoying personality, to battle enemies. The game featured Roiland's signature voice acting and humor, and received an incredibly negative response upon its initial reveal due to gamers believing that the talking weaponry would become very grating very fast. And it turns out they were correct.
Yeah, sorry about the spit. I needed to get you infected with the translator microbes. That's sort of how it works. I guess you guys don't have those here yet. Listen, my name's Kenny. I'm a Gatlian. We gotta move.
Did you close it?
I did.
You done?
Yeah.
What was wrong with it?
Just a little too heavy-handed.
Luckily, they did add a feature that allowed you to minimize the amount of talking in the game, which led to a more positive reaction from critics and fans alike. On November 30th, 2022, Justin Roiland guest-starred on a beloved YouTube channel named Red Letter Media, voicing his iconic characters.
Mike, why are we here again?
Because, Jay, this half-in-the-bag timeline is totally fucked.
What no one could have possibly guessed at the time was that this would be his last performance as Rick and Morty ever. On January 12th, 2023, NBC News broke the story that Justin Roiland had been charged with felony domestic battery and false imprisonment in connection with an incident that occurred 3 years prior with an anonymous woman he was dating. He was arrested and released on a $50,000 bond in August 2020 and arraigned in October. A protective order was also filed that prevented Roiland from going within 100 feet of the alleged victim. The Rick and Morty co-creator pleaded not guilty, and since then had quietly undergone several pre-trial hearings in the case, including one 4 days after the news emerged. His attorney, T. Edward Wellborn, lambasted the media coverage for the trial, saying, "To be clear, not only is Justin innocent, but we also have every expectation that this matter is on course to be dismissed." Justin himself said nothing. And he wasn't the only one. 2 days after the story came to light, there was not a single word uttered from any of the companies Roiland had contracts with. Then 3 days, then 4 days, then a week. Silence from Adult Swim, Hulu, 20th Television, and Squanch Games. Justin Roiland, who had started out as a down-to-earth geek making outrage-bait cartoons, was now the golden goose of the industry, an undisputed titan of the animation world. Dozens of brands, thousands of jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars had all rested on his shoulders for years. But the beatings would keep coming, and eventually more allegations would surface. Former Mad Magazine editor Ali Gortz was one of the first to go public with her story. On January 13th, one day after the news of the domestic violence case broke, she tweeted, "I'll say more later. For now, I'll just share the types of funny DMs Justin Roiland would send me. Posted and deleted this tweet last night because I was worried about any backlash. But this dude made me, someone who wrote a Rick and Morty concept album, never watch his show again." Included in the tweet was a screenshot of some of the messages she received from Roiland after she told her hero about the concept album she was writing for the show. Can you write a song about 9 dicks of different sized and ethnic origins hanging above your face, and then in the lyrics describe how they each splatter you with 1 minute later. Sorry, Allie, I'm on my 4th glass of wine. This was all off record. Don't break my trust, you asshole. JK, you're alright. After this, another woman came forward. This girl, who verified that she was underage at the time of the exchange, Justin texted her, "You should just run away from home and go into sex slavery, you fucking stupid fucking bitch." Just kidding. On top of this, old clips from the Grandma's Virginity podcast began to resurface, where Roiland's affinity for talking about his attraction to underage girls was showcased to the world.
Look, I'll say, look, a fucking 14-year-old that looks like she's 18 and like big
yeah.
Like, of course I'm attracted to that.
Ooh, yeah.
That's why this whole Chris Hansen thing, I'm like, F you, man. These girls are like, they're fully developed, and they're like, they talking online, I want you to
The girls that old men or women pretend to be to lure the files into the house?
Yeah, but they would email photos of what they look like, and the ones I saw were like, that girl's fully developed woman. Yeah, like...
On its own, this can be excused as boundary-pushing comedy from a time where sensibilities were different. When you present this next to several sexually explicit DMs with a minor and then criminal charges, it becomes a lot harder to defend. With this, people started to dogpile with other claims. Fans began turning on Justin, arguing he hadn't contributed to the TV show he had helped create in years. While they would turn out to be correct, it's important to note that they were working entirely off of speculation at this point. But still, the question remains, what would become of Rick and Morty? Roiland's voice was so inextricably tied to the series, both literally and in terms of its creative direction. Would his actions spell disaster for the former pop culture titan? Well, 12 days after the story broke, fans received their answer when Adult Swim announced that they had cut ties with Mr. Roiland, and that his roles as the titular characters of the show would be recast. In March of 2023, the charges of the original case were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Justin returned to Twitter the same day with a tweet that simply read, "Justice." Attached was his statement on the outcome of the court case. "I have always known that these claims were false, and I never had any doubts that this day would come. I'm thankful that this case has been dismissed, but at the same time, I'm still deeply shaken by the horrible lies that were reported about me during this process. Most of all, I'm disappointed that so many people were so quick to judge without knowing the facts, based solely on the word of an embittered ex trying to bypass due process and have me cancelled. That it may have succeeded, even partially, is shameful. However, now that the legal case has ended, I'm determined to move forward and focus both on my creative projects and restoring my good name." On September 13, 2023, NBC News published the conclusion of their months-long deep dive investigation in an article that outlined the allegations from nearly a dozen women, who had all come forward against Roiland since the domestic abuse case was announced. The article goes in depth on 3 of these victim stories. The first case NBC brought to light was that of a 20-year-old woman from Boston whose name they kept anonymous. In March 2019, Roiland messaged her on Tinder. "Hey, what's up, bitch? Just kidding." I do have to just stop here and point out that just because you say JK after something doesn't excuse what you said previously. "Hello, can we go shopping and have fun and I'll give you a fashion show and we can get coffee and talk? I think I'm down, yeah. It'd be cool with just hanging, maybe a drink, just talk and meet you." At that point, the woman mentioned again that she was not legally able to purchase alcohol since she was still 20 years old. "You don't drink ever? Haha, I'm actually not sure if I'm gonna drink either." According to NBC, that evening, Roiland took her out and purchased drinks for her. This was captured in a Snapchat video she recorded, although no archives were provided in the article. She claimed to have gotten slightly drunk during this time. Later, Roiland suggested that they go back to his hotel room, where she was pressured to perform oral sex on him, despite her initial objections. To quote the alleged victim, "From the moment it happened, I knew that it was not okay. But I felt a lot of different feelings. Like that it was my fault. I felt guilty for asking him to buy me stuff. I felt maybe I owed it to him, and I was embarrassed." Despite what happened that night, the woman kept in touch with Roiland, eventually confronting him several months later in June of 2019. "The sexual stuff that happened with us was not handled by you in the best way, and I just want you to take that into account in future dates. I know it was not black and white, but verbal consent is important. Yeah, I didn't. I'm really sorry. That's not cool at all. Jesus, that is not me whatsoever. I literally didn't get consent? I mean, you said after that you thought it turned me on to be forced. I told you that I would have preferred it didn't happen. Oh, Jesus Christ. I'm really sorry. Roiland's attorney Brettler refuted the woman's depiction of events, writing to NBC that she asked Roiland to buy her clothes and offered to sell him her pornographic videos a few months after that night, leaving his client feeling duped and taken advantage of. Another case NBC looked at was that of gender non-binary Jana Waters, who started speaking to Roiland in 2016 when he was 35 and they were just 16. The two exchanged the occasional Twitter message over the years, eventually swapping phone numbers and texting. In Waters' own words, "At first I really thought this guy wanted to be my friend, and I really needed friends at the time. He was a grown man. I was a teenage girl." When Waters was 17, they were invited by Roiland to visit him in Los Angeles, with him offering to cover the round-trip expenses. Waters expressed interest but reminded Roiland that they were still under 18. Haha, holy shit, I assumed you were. However, in 2019, when Waters was 20, Roiland invited them to a party for Squanch Games in Raleigh, North Carolina. Since they only lived a few hours away, Waters decided to drive out and attend. It was here that Roiland allegedly pressured the young person into drinking and engaging in inappropriate scenarios involving another woman, resulting in Jenna leaving the party early. The last time Waters communicated with Roiland was in May 2020. Reflecting on their interactions to NBC, Waters said that they no longer see Roiland as a friend or mentor, but believed that they were grooming them, seeking to develop a relationship that could eventually become sexual. Still, the worst case NBC brought to light was that of an unnamed woman from Pennsylvania who encountered Roiland when she was 19 years old in 2016. Their interaction began when the Rick and Morty co-creator, who was 36 at this point, noticed her fan art on social media. He initiated contact, complimenting her work and expressing interest in keeping in touch. Thrilled by the attention, the young woman shared her excitement online, marveling at the validation from the show's co-creator in a Facebook post. "I am not okay right now. The co-creator of Rick and Morty said my art is good." The two remained in contact, with their conversations eventually transitioning to text messages. As she would later describe to NBC, "Justin targeting me made me feel like I was special and chosen. Even just being followed by him on Twitter made me feel special because I'd see my name next to accomplished artists and people." In March 2017, Roiland invited her to visit him in Los Angeles, even offering to cover her travel expenses. Before she was allowed to go, though, her father spoke to the voice actor over FaceTime call, during which he sought reassurance about his daughter's safety and asked Justin what his intentions were. Roiland assured him that nothing bad would happen, a promise echoed in their subsequent texts. I didn't know your whole family was so concerned about this trip. They just didn't believe me, LMAO. But are they concerned that it wasn't actually me, or are they concerned no matter what? By the way, I totally understand it. I mean, they just love me a lot and don't want anything bad to happen to me. I will make absolute 100% sure nothing bad happens to you." Early text exchanges reveal that the 37-year-old had discussed sexual topics with her before the trip, and she had reciprocated, even sending him flirtatious pictures. Roiland asked her if she was possibly bi-curious, and she responded that she didn't think she was. Still, he told her that one of his female friends would be with them and that she might be interested in her. When she arrived in Los Angeles on March 31st, Roiland picked her up at the airport and brought her to a party he was hosting. As the night progressed and after most guests had left, she found herself alone with her idol and another woman. While the anonymous victim could only remember pieces of what ensued, she remembered being given liquor, and she remembered changing in the living room into a bathing suit and getting into the hot tub with Roiland and his acquaintance. In the hot tub, Roiland asked the two women to perform sexual acts on each other, which they did. The acclaimed cartoon writer then proceeded to have intercourse with the 20-year-old as the other woman watched, all of which the anonymous interviewee claimed to have been uncomfortable with. Following the incident, the woman returned to the guest bedroom feeling deeply unsettled and confused. She called a friend in her drunken state, sobbing, saying over and over that she is not a lesbian. Roiland texted her a fleet of messages later that night, using the iPhone sticker function to attach a pornographic image to multiple texts. "Hi, you okay? Talk to me. IDK, I'm weird. I'm not comfortable with, the girl stuff? Or just all of it? Also, you're not weird, you are awesome. I'm selfish and jealous and insecure, so anything involving more than 2 people trips me the F out, and I feel terrible about it. I'm awful. Ah, okay, I understand that. But I felt like you weren't okay. Unhappy emoticon. What does that mean? Can I come talk to you? You're not awful. You don't have to do that again. I want you to sleep with me tonight. Sorry for spamming the guy with the in his mouth. Unhappy emoticon, unhappy emoticon. I just want you to be happy and have a fun time here. I'll do whatever you need for that to be the case. I like cats and dogs. I really hope you just fell asleep. When you wake up, call me. I wish you were here. I'm sorry. The next day, the two once again engaged in sexual acts, with the Rick and Morty star even going so far as to film it despite her discomfort. Roiland's attorney later claimed that any sexual activity between his client and the woman was consensual, and that Roiland was not responsible for any acts that occurred between the woman and his female friend. After returning home, the TV creator and his alleged victim continued talking for a bit before things fizzled out. It took her time to come to terms with the experience and recognize that she had been taken advantage of. The trauma lingered as reflected in private social media posts she made years later, expressing the deep psychological impact the encounter had on her. In 2019, she posted a caption about Roiland that said, in part, "He's lucky I'm not the type of person who wants to be famous or well-known or anything like that, because he would have been exposed by now probably." So, how did the show's creators respond to the initial allegations that arose from various Twitter accounts? Well, multiple sources reported to publications that Roiland, aside from voice work, had not had any meaningful creative presence on any of the series that bear his name in quite some time. In fact, many of his former colleagues said that they hadn't heard from him in years, and when they had, it was unpleasant. This would culminate in another massive journalistic deep dive on Roiland, this time by The Hollywood Reporter. It was titled, Inside the Implosion of Justin Roiland's Animation Empire, which provided new dark insight into Roiland's diminishing role over the creative journey of the show just when fans thought it couldn't get any worse. According to the piece, the start of Justin's withdrawal from the Rick and Morty writers' room began all the way back in 2014, after the first season was an instant hit with fans and critics alike. Dan Harmon, known for his demanding standards, was particularly focused on making the second season even better, which meant longer hours, more scrutiny, and more rejection of silly ideas, which were Roiland's bread and butter. Harmon soon brought in a few writers from Community, which didn't show Justin the same respect that the Channel 101 guys did during the early days. The production became more divided, with Dan's guys being more structured, while Justin's guys were more chaotic. The two groups didn't mix. According to one of the Hollywood Reporter sources, Dan is all on the page and mathematical about story breaking, and these guys that Justin hired were like, "Look, I drew a turd with eyes. Let's do a story about that." The yin and yang of Dan Harmon's order and Justin Roiland's chaos is what created some of the most beloved television episodes of the 2010s. But it turns out that success was a ticking time bomb all along. It was during the writing of Season 2 that Roiland began pulling away, increasingly losing the enthusiasm for being in the room that had given him great joy just a year before. At one point, he sat so far from the other writers that he had to use a pair of binoculars just to read the ideas that had been pitched. According to people on the inside, he made it no secret that he would much rather be at home than work. Things only worsened from there. Once writing on the third season began, the first female writers had just barely settled in. Roiland was undeterred from drawing vulgar and phallic doodles on the office whiteboards. Another source mentioned that he was easily distracted. The writers would frequently visit Toys R Us to buy action figures and Nerf guns, and Justin would then spend the rest of the day playing with them, making it hard to get any work done. At some point during the third season, Roiland stopped showing up regularly. When he did come into the office, he often still avoided his responsibilities, with people only knowing he was there because they heard his dog or saw his remote control car. Justin did, however, make exceptions to bring famous fans to the show to visit, including Kanye West, the comedians from Impractical Jokers, and porn star Riley Reid, who gifted the room a, quote, succulent plant. The show's largely absent co-creator also reportedly spoke openly about the details of his sex life, specifically about he and his girlfriend's penchant for threesomes, making all of his subordinates uncomfortable. Multiple sources reported that during this period, Roiland sent a really creepy late-night text to a female employee, asking her to come to his home. His exact intentions weren't specified, but it probably isn't difficult to fill in the gaps. But this was somehow only the beginning. You see, up to this point, Justin still had to maintain at some level a professionalism in the workplace. After all, the jobs of the entire cast and crew relied on his show still being on the air, and that meant making sure it maintained a certain level of quality. But following the 70-episode renewal deal with Adult Swim, it meant that the train would keep moving regardless of what he did. This is when Justin really started to phone things in. Once the contract was signed, Roiland stopped showing up to work altogether, only contributing to the show at all by voice acting the characters in his home studio. He also did the same thing for his other projects like Solar Opposites. A source noted that the absentee creator knew the importance of being the voice talent, believing that securing these roles would protect him from being fired. It really did seem like fame destroyed the man. Even with his complete detachment from work, though, Roiland was still asked to make occasional public relations appearances or engage with fans, as he had gained a cult following in certain animation circles. He often did so while drunk, a fact he barely attempted to conceal.
Good.
Yeah, what's in that cup?
Just water.
Sure.
That was if he ever showed up at all. He often canceled appearances at the last minute or just stayed home without warning anyone ahead of time. While this proved to be a major point of frustration for his fellow creatives, time and time again network executives chose to turn a blind eye to his behavior due to how successful Rick and Morty was for them. But once the court case and allegations were revealed, public pressure became too great and they finally had no other option but to let Roiland go. Despite his importance to the show, at the end of the day, Rick and Morty was bigger than Justin. And when push came to shove, he was booted from his magnum opus after getting Me Too'd. This meant that Adult Swim had to search for new actors to take over his roles, particularly those of the titular characters themselves, so the search began. The details of this audition process remained very hush-hush over the next 6 months. The potential performers being tested in the booth used old episode scripts, and then played back their voices against the actual scenes from the show to see if they could notice any difference. The producers knew they were up against a devoted fan base that would put any new performance under a microscope. They paired up different actors to see if they had any particular chemistry that worked. The Hollywood Reporter conducted an interview with Dan Harmon around this time to discuss the search, the first time he was publicly asked about his cancelled co-creator and friends since the fallout. It had clearly been emotionally draining behind the scenes for him. It was very difficult, even in my short time at the end of this assembly line, where your ears very quickly get so confused when you're trying to tell the difference between a 9.5 and a 9.7 on the "does this sound like my friend" scale. So you quickly lose your objectivity. Eventually, they found their new stars, although the network did not reveal who they were when they released the trailer for the new season.
Hey look, Morty! I'm a leg! A leg, Morty!
When the series finally returned to television on October 15, 2023, Ian Cardone and Harry Belden were revealed to be the new voice actors for Rick and Morty respectively. A departure from the original model of having one man play both parts. And that was not the only change to the credits. For the first time in the show's history, the intro segment went without created by credits. And on shaky footing, Season 7 began.
I admit it, that was self-destructive.
As people tuned in to hear the new voices in the premiere, they would find the story of how Mr. Poopy Butthole's life fell apart, prompting Rick to help him regain his confidence and reputation by embarking on a chaotic adventure. If the first episode of Season 7 was a harbinger of things to come, it was a rough one. It was generally viewed as a bad story with bad jokes. But fans had become acclimated to the occasional poor script at this point. What mattered was the performances of Ian and Harry. To the credit of the voice actors, they did a decent job. This was particularly impressive because they weren't just faced with the challenging endeavor of replicating another person's voice, but they had the additional hurdle of matching their performance to fit the exact lip movements of already animated scenes. It would obviously take some time for devoted viewers to get used to the differences in the performances compared to Roiland, but this proved to be a solid first attempt. In episode 4, That's Amorte, Morty discovers Rick's famous spaghetti is sourced from a suicidal planet, causing a societal upheaval. Rick's attempts to correct his mistake fails, leading to a morbid broadcast that ultimately stops the demand for the grotesque pasta. This episode was the first to have a warning beforehand. There was apparently a lot of debate behind the scenes as to whether or not the content depicted in the story was too dark, even by the already edgy standards of Rick and Morty. To quote one of the showrunners, the network had to be like, "We're not sure we can let you make this episode." And then the head of the network read the script and was like, "I'll allow it because the execution is so brilliant. I think you handle it really well, but I don't think most other places would let this one fly." Not only did Adult Swim ultimately allow That's Amorte to make it to air, but they even made it a prominent part of the marketing campaign for the new season, proving they were still willing to take risks with their rapidly fading star. Despite the concerns and the hype behind it though, this episode failed to make a significant splash. It begs the question though, would it have generated a wider discussion if it had come out just a few years earlier, before the general public lost interest in Rick and Morty? Next up in episode 5, our heroes team up with Evil Morty to stop Rick Prime, who has created a device to erase people from all universes. During the struggle, they confront their past traumas, leading to a deeper understanding of their shared history and ongoing conflicts. This was a huge load for the new voice actors to tackle, and they fared admirably. The plot concludes with the device that can eradicate every possible version of a person across infinite realities ending up in the hands of Evil Morty. It's a cool idea in the moment that undeniably establishes higher stakes that the show had never had before, but it also, in a way, fully dismantles the entire mantra of Rick and Morty. The whole point of a truly infinite universe is that nothing matters. That theme of nihilism is wiped out by the introduction of this weapon. This episode ends with a reprise of the final scene of Rick Potion number 9. Instead of a traumatized Morty though, we have an adrift and numb Rick. A pretty sweet and effective parallel by the show's writers. In episode 8, a character named Water T arrives on Earth seeking help from Mr. Goldenfold, Morty's math teacher. Morty himself eventually gets involved, and the group are entangled in a conflict between sentient numbers and letters. People did not like this one. This is essentially a 22-minute parody of cheesy Saturday morning cartoons from the 90s, and is noteworthy for a few reasons. First of all, this is the first episode to not feature Rick at all. And secondly, it stands as the lowest rated installment in the show's history on IMDb at 4.5 out of 10. Fans were not messing with this one. Worst Rick and Morty episode ever. What did I just watch? I think watching paint dry would have been more exciting. At the end of the day, people were just becoming bored. We're finally at the last episode of Season 7, where Rick and Morty enter the fear hole and confront their deepest fears. This ended the season on a strong note by delivering one of the best installments in years. A genuinely funny story filled with clever misleads and trope subversions that explores the characters in a more interesting way than had been done in a very long time. To give you an idea of how well received this episode was by fans, it has a higher audience rating than Rick Mirai Jack, the season 5 finale where Rick's backstory was finally revealed, and Evil Morty returned after 4 years. Fans loved this episode that much. All in all, Season 7 of Rick and Morty had some highlights and some low points, but it accomplished its only real goal, getting the audience used to the idea of a new voice. In September of 2023, during the airing of this newest batch of episodes, Dan Harmon finally released a statement on the allegations against his longtime creative partner in an interview. The easiest thing for me to say about Justin has been nothing. Easy because he isolated so well, and easy because I'm nobody's first choice as a judge of anything or anyone. This is where I'd love to change the subject to myself, to what a piece of crap I've been my whole public life. I would feel so safe and comfortable making this about me, but that trick is worthless here and dangerous to others. It's other people's safety and comfort that got damaged while I obsessed over a cartoon's quality. Trust has now been violated between countless people and a show designed to please them. I'm frustrated, ashamed, and heartbroken that a lot of hard work, joy, and passion can be leveraged to exploit and harm strangers. Harmon revealed that the last time he and Roiland spoke was over text in 2019, 4 years before he was cancelled publicly, in a conversation that left Harmon in tears. He said things that he had never said before about being unhappy, and I remember saying to him the last time we spoke in person like, "I am worried about you, and I don't know what to do about that except to give you all the strings and also just say I'm scared that you're not going to come back." During the airing of Rick and Morty's 7th season, 2 more animated Harmon shows that had been in production for years finally aired: Krapopolis on Fox and Strange Planet on Apple TV. You have likely never heard of either, which just goes to show how significantly the media landscape has changed. But just because Harmon's new ventures weren't taking off, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a new animated series to come in to take over the fame Rick and Morty once had. You see, as Rick and Morty's stardom fizzled out, a new show emerged from Adult Swim that would take hold of the zeitgeist: Smiling Friends. Created by longtime YouTube animators Michael Cusack and Zach Hadel. Their big break came when Adult Swim, always on the lookout for strange and unique content, greenlit a pilot from them in 2019, which aired as part of Adult Swim's April Fool's Day event. Adult Swim quickly ordered a full season in 2020. Despite the challenges of the production, which forced everyone to work remotely, the creators dove into production with full creative control. They were involved in every detail, from writing and voice acting to directing and animating. This hands-on approach kept the show true to their original vision: light, funny, and bizarre. The full season was aired all at once in 2022, and was received warmly by fans of the 2 co-creators. The show achieved even more popularity with its 2nd season, although it has remained in the sweet spot of it being a series with a mostly online fanbase, not accruing the same mass acclaim as Rick and Morty, and thus avoiding the ubiquity that turned many off from the sci-fi show. That's not to say that the show has totally avoided all of the same pitfalls of Harmon and Roiland's creation. Since the 2nd season has aired, Smiling Friends fanbase has started to grow a slightly similar reputation as Rick and Morty's for overrating the show's quality and being generally annoying. I guess that's just an inevitability of achieving a certain level of recognition in any artistic medium, although animation fans have historically tended to be particularly overzealous. Regardless, with this new success, many people have deemed Smiling Friends Adult Swim's new golden child. As the dust settled, most people agreed that Adult Swim had made the right decision by firing Justin Roiland. His actions simply brought too much baggage for the show to carry. But the truth is, Rick and Morty was long gone before Roiland was given the boot. What started as a blissful, creative, fulfilling, off-the-wall exercise for longtime friends with a unique vision to push the boundaries of animated storytelling has now become a writer's room composed of millennial fans of the show that lies in the shadow of a tragic breakup between the original creators. And the performers they're writing for is not the same person who cultivated these voices back in 2006, but rather 2 young actors in their late 20s who have earned the job by being the best out of thousands of impersonators. There's something deeply sad about how the story of the show had played out, but maybe this ending was inevitable. In Dan Harmon's own words, "I kind of feel like my job these days is to log into a Zoom and tell younger, smarter, funnier, more conscientious people a bunch of bibble-babble about my personal life in reference to the story we're trying to break. And their job is to patiently wait for me to leave the room so they can get back to work. Because what else am I going to do? They're the ones who have to worry about their future careers. So they listen and then they write things that are wonderful and funny in their own way, and it's a good time to retire." It would be an act of pure immaturity and hubris to expect Rick and Morty to evoke the same feelings we had during the early seasons indefinitely. Of course, old writers leave and new writers come in. Of course, the fan base will become cancerous. Of course, the show will have episodes or even entire seasons that disappoint us. Of course, the creator will be outed as a monster. Welcome to television. Whatever else you can say about Rick and Morty, it's a show that craves your approval. Even when it falls short, you can still see its failures' earnest attempts to evolve and improve. In its recent seasons, it still stands head and shoulders above many of its peers in terms of entertainment, creativity, and sheer inventiveness. And even now, it still rakes in millions of dollars. This includes a recent anime spin-off. Something tells me there's still a lot of Rick and Morty left to explore, for many years to come. Maybe even 100.